Hello friends. Welcome to Ultimate Fanfiction. How are you all? So we are back with an interesting movie on what if Naruto was the summoned sage king WH. chose a quiet life, Naruto X Sword Maiden, Goblin Slayer. Also be sure to subscribe and like this video. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Sage of the Frontier. The sun, a benevolent tyrant of molten gold, held dominion over the vast, rolling plains that cradled the village of Oakhaven. It was the heart of the harvest season, a time of communal toil and shared anticipation. The air, crisp and kissed with the first faint chill of autumn, carried the earthy perfume of tilled soil and the sweet, cloying scent of ripened grain. Naruto Uzumaki, a man whose past was a tapestry woven with threads of unimaginable violence and world-altering power, found a simple, profound satisfaction in the rhythmic swing of his scythe. The blade, an extension of his will, whispered through the wheat, each pass a clean, decisive stroke that laid the golden stalks low. He worked with an economy of motion that bordered on the supernatural, his movements a fluid dance that belied the raw, untamed power coiled within him like a slumbering dragon. To the people of Oakhaven, he was simply Naruto, the stranger who had wandered into their lives a year prior, a man of few words but boundless kindness. He was the one who could mend a broken axle with a gentle touch and a whispered word, the one whose presence seemed to soothe the most cantankerous of livestock, the one who could predict the weather with an unnerving accuracy by simply tasting the wind. They saw a man of immense physical strength, his sun-kissed blonde hair often matted with sweat, his cerulean eyes holding a depth that spoke of a life lived far beyond the confines of their sleepy village. They saw the strange, swirling tattoo on his abdomen when he bathed in the river, a mark they attributed to some forgotten tribal custom. They did not see the Sage King, the hero summoned from a world of shinobi and chakra to vanquish a demon lord that had brought their own world to its knees. They did not see the man who had stared into the abyss and made it blink. And that was precisely how Naruto wanted it. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of tranquility. He awoke with the rooster's crow, his senses extending far beyond the confines of his small, rustic cabin, feeling the gentle pulse of life in the sleeping village, the rustle of a fox in the distant woods, the slow, inexorable turning of the world itself. He would spend his days in the fields. The simple, honest labor a balm to a soul weary of war. He would share his evenings with the villagers, listening to their simple stories, their joys and their sorrows, a silent observer in the grand, unfolding drama of their lives. He had found a fragile, precious peace in this forgotten corner of the world, a peace he would protect with the same ferocity he had once reserved for his own world. His control over chakra, the lifeblood of his former world, was now repurposed for the mundane. He would channel a sliver of his immense reserves into the soil, subtly enriching it, ensuring a bountiful harvest. He would use his mastery of fuinjutsu, the art of sealing, to create intricate, invisible barriers around the village, wards that repelled the more dangerous beasts of the forest and discouraged bandits from venturing too close. To the villagers, their recent run of good fortune was a blessing from the gods. To Naruto, it was simply Tuesday. He paused in his work, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His sage-enhanced senses, a constant, low hum in the back of his mind, picked up a discordant note in the symphony of the world. A flutter of fear, a spike of adrenaline, the acrid stench of blood on the wind. It was faint, distant, but it was there, a jarring cacophony in the otherwise peaceful melody of the day. He turned his gaze towards the west, towards the old miller's farm, a place of quiet solitude even by Oakhaven's standards. A young woman, Alara, the miller's daughter, was frantically trying to herd their prized sheep into the safety of the barn. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. They had come out of the woods so suddenly, a wave of grotesque, green-skinned creatures, their eyes glowing with a malevolent red light in the deepening twilight. Goblins. Small, yes, but their numbers were overwhelming, their cruel, high-pitched shrieks echoing through the fields. One of the creatures, larger and more brutish than the rest, broke away from the pack, its rusty scimitar held high. Alara screamed, stumbling backward, her eyes wide with terror. This was it. This was how her life would end, a brutal, meaningless death at the hands of a monster. And then, he was there. He hadn't run. He had simply arrived. One moment, the space between her and the goblin was empty. The next, Naruto stood there, his back to her. A bulwark against the tide of darkness. He hadn't drawn a weapon. His hands were empty, his posture relaxed, almost casual. Yet, the air around him seemed to shimmer, to crackle with an unseen energy. The goblin champion, its mind a cesspool of primal rage and bloodlust, did not hesitate. It lunged, its scimitar a blur of rusty metal. Naruto didn't even seem to move. There was a faint sigh of displaced air. A whisper of movement too fast for the eye to follow. The goblin's charge was arrested, its weapon hand caught in Naruto's grip. The creature's eyes widened in a brief, fleeting moment of shocked disbelief before its arm, and the scimitar it held, were twisted into an unnatural angle. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the goblin crumpled to the ground, its brief, violent life extinguished. The rest of the goblin pack, their courage bolstered by numbers, surged forward, a chittering, screeching wave of green-skinned death. Naruto moved among them like a phantom, a whisper of death in the twilight. He was a blur of motion, his strikes precise and devastatingly effective. A palm heel to the chest of one, a sweeping leg kick that sent another cartwheeling through the air. A deft redirection of a clumsy spear thrust that sent its wielder stumbling into its own comrades. He moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, a dance of death that was over in a matter of seconds. And then, silence. The field was littered with the broken bodies of the goblins. Naruto stood in the center of the carnage, his breathing even, his expression unreadable. He turned to Alara, his cerulean eyes softening as he saw the terror in her own. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low, calming rumble. She could only nod, her words stolen by the shock of what she had just witnessed. She had seen him lift hay bales that would have taken 3 men to move. She had seen him work for hours without breaking a sweat. But this was something else entirely. This was the quiet, unassuming stranger revealing himself to be a force of nature, a silent, deadly protector who had dispatched a dozen monsters without so much as breaking a sweat. Meanwhile, in the bustling city of Silverhaven, miles away from the quiet tranquility of Oakhaven, a young woman named Lily sat at her desk, a stack of reports threatening to overwhelm her. As a senior administrator for the Adventurers Guild, her life was a whirlwind of paperwork, contracts, and the constant, nagging worry of adventurers who were either too reckless or not skilled enough for the jobs they took. Her latest headache was a series of reports from the frontier, a region largely ignored by the central government. Increased monster activity, missing travelers, and now, a disturbing pattern of goblin attacks. More organized and more aggressive than usual. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned a report from the guild's small, understaffed branch in Oakhaven. It was a brief, almost dismissive report, stating that a recent goblin threat had been dealt with. No details, no request for reinforcements, just a single, enigmatic sentence. This was a deviation from the norm. Guild Bran, chests were usually screaming for more resources, not turning them down. Her curiosity piqued. She penned a letter to the Oakhaven branch master, her quill scratching against the parchment in the flickering candlelight. She inquired about the situation, about the unregistered individual, who, according to local rumors, was a man of immense power and skill. She wanted to know who this man was, what his capabilities were, and why he was not registered with the guild. A man of such power operating outside of their system was a variable she could not afford to ignore. Back in Oakhaven, Naruto stood on the edge of the village. His gaze fixed on the distant, mist-shrouded mountains. The goblin attack on the miller's farm was not a random occurrence. His sage senses could feel it now, a festering wound in the heart of the mountains. A gathering darkness that pulsed with a malevolent energy. This was not a small, disorganized band of goblins. This was an army. A storm was brewing, a storm that threatened to shatter the fragile peace he had so carefully constructed. He sighed, a sound of weary resignation. It seemed that no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to hide, the world would always find a way to drag him back into the fray. His quiet life, it seemed, was about to get a lot more complicated. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. A Maiden's Plea. The golden age of the harvest was brutally and unceremoniously drowned. A relentless, dreary rain began to fall, a curtain of gray that washed the color from the world and turned the once golden fields into a quagmire of mud and despair. The sky, a bruised and sullen purple, wept without cease, its tears drumming a mournful dirge on the thatched roofs of Oakhaven. The villagers, their harvest half done, huddled in their homes, their moods as somber as the weather. The crisp, clean air of autumn had been replaced by a damp, cloying chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the world. For Naruto, the rain was a physical manifestation of his own disquiet. The peaceful symphony of the world he had come to cherish was now a discordant mess, the rhythmic patter of the rain a constant, nagging reminder of the storm he knew was gathering in the mountains. He spent his days in a state of quiet contemplation, his senses extended, a silent sentinel watching over the village. He reinforced his Fuinjutsu seals, weaving intricate new patterns of chakra into the very fabric of the air around Oakhaven, creating a multi-layered defense system that was as invisible as it was impenetrable. He felt the fear of the villagers, a low, constant hum of anxiety that permeated the very air they breathed. The story of Alara's miraculous rescue had spread like wildfire, a tale whispered in hushed tones around flickering hearths. They spoke of Naruto not as a man, but as a guardian spirit, a protective entity that had chosen their village as his domain. The awe in their eyes had been replaced by a mixture of reverence and fear. A new distance growing between him and the very people he had sought to live among. His quiet life was eroding, washed away by the relentless rain and the encroaching darkness. It was on the third day of the ceaseless downpour that they arrived. A carriage, its wheels churning through the mud, rumbled into the village, its ornate design and the sigil of the capital emblazoned on its doors a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of Oakhaven. It was accompanied by a small retinue of guards, their armor slick with rain, their faces grim and weary. The carriage door opened, and a woman stepped out, her presence a beacon of light in the gray, dreary landscape. She was tall and graceful, her movements fluid and deliberate. She wore the pristine white robes of a high-ranking priestess, her gold hair braided into an intricate coronet that framed a face of breathtaking, yet sorrowful, beauty. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, held a depth of pain that seemed at odds with her serene demeanor. This was Sword Maiden, a legend in her own right, a high priestess of the supreme god, a former adventurer whose name was synonymous with both righteous fury and tragic loss. And behind her, stepping out of the carriage with a boisterous grunt, was her polar opposite. She was a dwarf, stout and strong, her fiery red hair braided with iron rings. She wore chainmail over her priestly robes, a warhammer strapped to her back, and a tankard hanging from her belt. Her face was a roadmap of a life lived with gusto, her eyes twinkling with a mischievous light. This was Brunhild, a dwarf priestess of the Earth Mother, a runesmith of renown, and a woman who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with either a prayer or a swing of her hammer. The villagers, drawn from their homes by the commotion, stared in stunned silence. Such important figures had never graced their humble village before. The village elder, a man whose face was a testament to a long and simple life, hurried forward, bowing low. "Welcome, honored guests," he stammered, his voice quavering with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "To what do we owe this unexpected honor?" Sword Maiden's gaze swept over the village, her eyes lingering on the subtle, almost imperceptible shimmer of the barrier Naruto had erected. "We have come seeking a protector," she said, her voice a soft, melodic chime that carried a surprising weight of authority. "We have heard whispers of a man of great power who resides in this village, a man who single-handedly dispatched a goblin war party." The elder's eyes darted nervously towards Naruto's cabin, which sat on a small hill overlooking the village. We are a simple people, my lady. We know nothing of such things." Brunhild snorted, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Don't play coy with us, old-timer. There's powerful magic at work here. I can feel it in my bones. Ancient runes, the likes of which I haven't seen since I was alas exploring the deepest, most forgotten halls of my home citadel. Now, point us to the one responsible." Her gaze, sharp and discerning, also fell upon Naruto's cabin. Her eyes, unlike Sword Maiden's, saw not the shimmer of a barrier, but the intricate, invisible lines of kanji that Naruto had woven into the very fabric of existence. She saw a masterful work of art, a form of runecraft so advanced, so elegant, that it made her own considerable skill seem like a child's scribbles. All eyes turned to Naruto, who had emerged from his cabin and was now walking down the muddy path towards them. He moved with a quiet, unassuming grace. the rain seeming to part for him, his simple farmer's clothes untouched by the downpour. He stopped before the newcomers, his cerulean eyes calm and unreadable. "I am Naruto," he said simply, his voice a low, even tone. "How can I help you?" Sword Maiden studied him, her gaze analytical and cautious. This was the man she had heard about. This simple farmer. He was handsome, she admitted to herself, with a rugged, unassuming charm. But she had seen countless men who projected an aura of strength. She needed more than just whispers and rumors. "I am Sword Maiden," she said, her tone formal. "And this is Priestess Brunhild. We have come on a matter of great urgency. The frontier is being plagued by a goblin infestation of unprecedented scale. A nest, larger and more organized than any we have ever encountered, has taken root in the nearby mountains. They are a threat to this entire region." Naruto's expression did not change. "I am aware of the threat," he said, his gaze drifting towards the ominous, mist-shrouded peaks. "Then you must understand the gravity of the situation," Sword Maiden pressed. "We are assembling a force to eradicate this nest, but we are outmatched. We need your power. The stories say you are a warrior of immense skill." Naruto's mind drifted back, a torrent of unwanted memories flooding his consciousness. He saw the battlefields of his youth, the faces of his comrades. The blood and the mud and the endless, soul-crushing violence. He saw the moments of triumph, the cheers of the crowd, the adulation of the people he had saved. And he saw the quiet, lonely nights that followed, the weight of his power a heavy, suffocating blanket. He had defeated a godlike being, had saved his world from eternal damnation. And what had it brought him? A lifetime of being seen as a weapon, a tool, a symbol. He had not come to this world to be a hero again. "I am a farmer," he said, his voice flat, his gaze turning back to Sword Maiden. "The stories you have heard are exaggerated. I am not the man you are looking for." Brunhild let out a hearty laugh. "A farmer, lad, the runes you've woven around this village are the work of a master craftsman, a sage of the highest order. A farmer, my axe. Don't try to pull the wool over the eyes of a dwarf who has spent centuries studying the ancient arts." Sword Maiden's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is this true? You are the one responsible for the barrier protecting this village." Naruto gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I have taken some precautions." Precautions. Sword Maiden's voice as laced with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "A barrier of such power is more than a mere precaution. It is a fortress wall. You have the power to save countless lives, yet you choose to hide here, in this backwater village, while innocent people are being slaughtered by goblins." Her words were a sharp, pointed barb, and for a moment, Naruto's calm facade wavered. He saw her pain, the righteous anger in her eyes. And he recognized it. It was the same fire that had once burned within him. But he had carried that fire for so long, and it had seared his very soul. "I have done my part," he said, his voice low and firm. "I have saved a world. I have earned my peace." The air grew thick with tension. Sword Maiden stared at him, her disappointment a palpable thing. Brunhild, for once, was silent, her gaze flickering between the two of them, a newfound respect for the blonde-haired man dawning in her eyes. He had saved a world. What kind of man was this? Their standoff was interrupted by a frantic cry. A young boy, his face pale with terror, came sprinting into the village, his clothes torn and spattered with mud. "Goblins!" he screamed, his voice raw with panic. "A merchant caravan on the East Road, they're being slaughtered." Naruto's head snapped up, his sage senses already confirming the boy's story. He could feel the spikes of terror, the stench of blood, the triumphant, cruel shrieks of the goblins. It was a brutal, bloody massacre, and it was happening less than a mile from his self-imposed sanctuary. He closed his eyes, a wave of weary resignation washing over him. He had truly tried to leave it all behind. But his conscience, the part of him that was still the boy who had sworn to protect everyone, would not allow it. He could not stand by and do nothing while innocent people were being slaughtered on his doorstep. He opened his eyes, and the calm, unassuming farmer was gone. In his place stood the sage king, his cerulean eyes now blazing with a cold, righteous fury. The air around him crackled with an unseen energy, and the very rain seemed to shy away from him. "Stay here," he said, his voice a command that brooked no argument. Protect the villagers. And then, he was gone. Not in a blur of motion, but in a flash of yellow light, a technique from his past that he had not used in years. One moment he was there, the next, he was gone. Leaving behind a stunned sword maiden, a wide-eyed Brunhild, and a village that was just beginning to understand the true nature of their quiet, unassuming protector. He reappeared on the East Road. The scene of the massacre laid out before him. It was a bloodbath. The merchant caravan was in ruins, its wagons overturned and burning. The bodies of the merchants and their guards were strewn across the road. Their lives brutally cut short. A horde of goblins, larger and more organized than the ones that had attacked the miller's farm, were swarming over the wreckage, their cruel laughter echoing in the rain-soaked air. They were led by a goblin shaman, its gnarled staff crackling with a sickly green energy. It was chanting in a guttural language, a foul incantation that was causing the bodies of the fallen to stir, to rise again as shambling, undead puppets. Naruto did not hesitate. He moved forward, a silent, deadly whirlwind of destruction. He was no longer the graceful, gentle warrior who had dispatched the goblins at the miller's farm. This was Naruto Uzumaki, the Jinchuriki of the Nine-Tailed Fox, the veteran of the Fourth Great Ninja War, and he was filled with a cold, righteous rage. He formed a Rasengan in his palm, the swirling sphere of pure chakra, a miniature, self-contained storm. He slammed it into the ground, and the very earth erupted, a massive avenue of energy that sent goblins and their undead puppets flying. He moved through the remaining goblins like a vengeful god, his strikes precise and utterly devastating. He was a blur of orange and black, a phantom of death that left only broken bodies in his wake. The goblin shaman, its eyes wide with terror, tried to flee, but Naruto was already there, his hand clamped around its throat. He looked into the creature's malevolent red eyes, and he saw not a simple monster, but a spark of cunning intelligence, a deep-seated hatred that was fueled by a dark, ancient power. "Who sent you?" Naruto growled, his voice a low, menacing rumble. The shaman only cackled, a wet, gurgling sound, before its body dissolved into a cloud of black, foul-smelling smoke. Naruto stood in the center of the carnage, the rain washing the blood from his hands. He had saved no one here. He had only been an instrument of vengeance. He looked at the bodies of the fallen, the innocent lives that had been extinguished. And he knew that his quiet life was well and truly over. He could not hide from this. He could not ignore it. The darkness that was gathering in the mountains was a cancer, and if he did not cut it out, it would consume everything he had come to care about. He walked back to the village, his steps heavy with the weight of his decision. Sword Maiden and Brunhild were waiting for him at the entrance, their expressions a mixture of awe and apprehension. They had felt the surge of power, the raw, untamed energy that had been unleashed on the East Road. They had seen the flash of yellow light. This was a man who could bend the very fabric of reality to his will. "I will help you," Naruto said, his voice devoid of its earlier reluctance. "I will help you destroy this goblin nest. But we do it my way." Sword Maiden nodded, a look of profound relief on her face. "Of course, we will follow your lead." Brunhild grinned, a wide, toothy smile that was both unnerving and infectious. "Now we're talking. I knew you were no simple farmer, lad. I can't wait to see what other tricks you have up your sleeve." As they stood there, the rain finally began to subside, the thick, gray clouds parting to reveal a sliver of the setting sun. A ray of golden light broke through, illuminating the three of them, a silent promise of the dawn that was to come. Naruto, Sword Maiden, and Brunhild, three unlikely allies brought together by fate, stood on the precipice of a new war. Naruto's quiet life was over, but a new chapter, a chapter of fire and blood and righteous fury, was just beginning. They would venture into the goblin-infested mountains, into the very heart of the darkness, and they would show the world the true power of the Sage King. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. The Council of War and the Whispers of the Past. The largest barn in Oakhaven, a place that normally smelled of sweet hay and warm livestock, had been transformed. The scent of rain-soaked earth, old wood, and drying leather now mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of polished steel and the subtle, ozonic hum of potent magic. A makeshift council room had been established around a large, sturdy oak table, its surface scarred by generations of farm work. Lanterns cast a warm, flickering glow, creating a small bubble of civilization against the encroaching night. Outside, the wind had picked up, a mournful, whistling sigh that rattled the barn's wooden frame, a constant reminder of the cold, hostile world that lay just beyond their sanctuary. The atmosphere within was thick with a tension that was a stark, jarring contrast to the barn's rustic charm. Naruto stood at the head of the table, his simple farmer's clothes doing little to diminish the aura of quiet authority that now clung to him like a second skin. He was no longer the unassuming stranger, he was a commander in his element. Before him were 4 women, each a powerhouse in her own right, each now looking to him for guidance. Sword Maiden sat with a regal poise, her hands clasped before her, her expression a mask of serene focus that barely concealed the storm of questions raging within her. Beside her, Brunhild leaned back in her chair, which groaned in protest under her weight, her arms crossed over her broad chest, a critical, yet intrigued, glint in her eyes. 2 newcomers, who had arrived with Sword Maiden's main retinue, flanked the opposite side. One was a high elf, her posture as straight and unyielding as the ancient trees of her homeland. Her name was Seraphina Vale, and she was, by trade and by nature, a ranger. Her hair was the color of spun silver, braided intricately down her back, and her eyes were a startling shade of violet, sharp and analytical, missing nothing. Her expression was one of cool, detached skepticism, her people's long and painful history with a summoned hero from a bygone era having instilled in her a deep-seated distrust of outsiders wielding immense power. Her speech, when she chose to speak, was formal, precise, and often edged with a dry, cutting sarcasm. She valued deeds, not words, and this, farmer, had yet to earn her respect. The final member of their war council was a human knight captain named Kalen Ironhand. She was the epitome of military discipline, her steel-plate armor polished to a mirror shine, her bearing stoic and unshakable. Her dark hair was cut short, practical and severe, and her face was handsome in a way that spoke of strength and unwavering resolve rather than delicate beauty. She was a woman bound by the twin pillars of duty and honor, but beneath the rigid exterior was a pragmatist who understood the brutal calculus of war. She observed Naruto not with skepticism, but with a professional, assessing gaze, her mind already weighing his potential as a strategic asset. Her dialogue was blunt, direct, and stripped of all unnecessary pleasantries. The intel provided by the capital is incomplete, Kalen began, her voice a crisp, no-nonsense bar. Eton as she gestured to a crude map spread on the table. It marks the primary nest here, she tapped a location deep within the mountain range, but suggests a goblin force of no more than a few hundred. The massacre at the caravan suggests a far greater number. Numbers are only part of the problem, Sword Maiden added, her voice a soft counterpoint to Kalen's martial tone. The shaman at the caravan, the magic it wielded was dark, corrupting. It was not simple goblin sorcery. Naruto listened, his eyes closed, his fingers tracing patterns on the tabletop. He wasn't just listening to their words, he was extending his senses. A delicate web of sage chakra that flowed out from him, over the rain-soaked fields, through the whispering forests, and up the jagged slopes of the mountain range. He was painting a picture in his mind, a living, breathing map of the enemy's domain. He finally opened his eyes, and the calm, cerulean blue was now tinged with a faint, golden glow. He knelt, and with a single, calloused finger, began to draw in the dirt floor of the barn. The lines he drew were impossibly precise, forming a perfect, three-dimensional topographical map of the mountains, complete with ridges, valleys, and cave entrances that were not on Kalen's official map. His companions watched, their skepticism and professionalism slowly giving way to a sense of profound awe. The main nest isn't one location, Naruto stated, his voice a low, confident rumble. It's a network. The main entrance is here, he pointed to a large opening on the map he had drawn, but it's a bottleneck. A death trap. They expect a frontal assault. He then began to mark other, smaller points on his dirt map. There are 3 primary patrol routes, converging here, here, and here. They rotate on a 4-hour schedule. The patrols aren't random, they're disciplined, searching for resources. Or, timber, slaves. The last word hung in the air, heavy and ugly. There are captives, Sword Maiden asked, her voice tight with controlled fury. Naruto nodded grimly. Dozens. Kept deep within the network, Here. They're being used for labor, and for breeding. A wave of revulsion washed over the women. Serafina, who had remained silent until now, spoke, her voice sharp and challenging. And how could you possibly know this? Have you been inside this nest? Naruto met her violet gaze without flinching. I can feel them, he said simply. I can feel their fear. I can also feel the one they serve. The leader. It's not a goblin. He tapped the very center of the mountain he had drawn. It's deep, powerful, and ancient. It's the source of the shaman's power. It's what's making the goblins so organized, so intelligent. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands, and outlined his strategy. It was nothing like the simple, brutal assaults they were accustomed to. A frontal attack is what they want. It's what they're prepared for. We will not give it to them. His plan was a multi-pronged masterpiece of infiltration, sabotage, and assassination. Phase 1. Serafina and I will infiltrate the network through a series of submerged geothermal vents on the mountain's western face. Our objective is to neutralize the shamans who maintain their command structure and to locate and free the prisoners. Speed and stealth are paramount. Serafina's eyebrows shot up. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Yet he spoke of it with such calm certainty. While we are inside, Naruto continued, his gaze shifting to the other 3 women, you will be phase 2. You will not attack. You will create a series of loud, chaotic, and ultimately harmless diversions along the eastern flank. Use your magic, Brunhild. Create illusions of rockslides. Sword Maiden, your divine magic can create flashes of light, sounds of battle. Kalen, your troops will make their presence known, but they will not engage. You are the Feint. Your job is to draw the bulk of their forces to the east, to make them believe a massive army is preparing to assault the main gate. And phase 3, Kalen asked, her professional curiosity now fully engaged. This was strategy on a level she had only read about in historical texts. Phase 3, Naruto said, a dangerous glint in his eyes, is when Serafina and I have freed the prisoners and eliminated the shamans. The goblin horde will be leaderless, confused, and terrified. Their command structure will be in chaos. That is when you will attack the main gate. You will not be charging a prepared fortress, you will be mopping up a panicked, disorganized mob. The sheer audacity and elegance of the plan left them speechless. It was a strategy that minimized their own risk while maximizing enemy chaos. Serafina was the first to recover. Your plan hinges entirely on our ability to infiltrate a fortress teeming with thousands of goblins, navigate its depths, and eliminate its most powerful defenders, all without being detected. It is optimistic. I am a very optimistic person. Naruto replied with a ghost of a smile. He then looked directly at her. Their northern perimeter is weakest between the 3rd and 4th hour after moonrise. They use giant bats as aerial scouts. But the updrafts from the geothermal vents disrupt their flight patterns. The water in the vents is hot, but I can regulate the temperature. The entrance is guarded by a single, half-blind cave troll that is more of a pet than a guard. It likes the taste of a particular type of glowing mushroom that grows 30 paces to the left of the vent's entrance. A simple offering will be enough to distract it. He delivered this impossibly detailed information with the casual air of a man discussing the weather. Serafina stared at him, her skepticism finally cracking, replaced by a bewildering mix of disbelief and fascination. The information was too specific, too precise, to be a guess. He knew. Somehow, he knew. It was the mention of the shamans that triggered it. A fleeting, unwelcome memory, sharp as a shard of glass, pierced the calm exterior of Naruto's mind. He was no longer in the barn. He was back on the blood-soaked battlefields of the 4th Great Ninja War. The air thick with the smell of ozone and death. He saw the face of Shikamaru Nara, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and fierce concentration, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he pointed to a map drawn in the sand. The enemy's sensory unit is their linchpin, Naruto. Take them out, and their whole formation collapses into chaos. The memory was so vivid, so real, that he flinched. A barely perceptible tremor that ran through his body. He blinked, and the barn, the lanterns, and the faces of his companions swam back into focus. He had suppressed that life, buried it deep, but the instincts, the muscle memory of a lifetime of war, were still there, just beneath the surface. Sword Maiden, her perception honed by years of dealing with the subtle signs of trauma and pain, noticed his momentary distress. She saw the flicker of a haunted past in his eyes, a depth of sorrow that resonated with her own. Her curiosity about him deepened, transforming from a tactical assessment into a genuine, personal concern. Who was this man, who could plan a war with such chilling precision, yet carried such a heavy, hidden burden? Brunhild, ever the pragmatist, slammed her tankard down on the table. The loud bang startling everyone out of their thoughts. "Well, I'm convinced," she boomed, a wide, predatory grin spreading across her face. "It's the most gloriously insane and brilliant plan I've ever heard. I haven't had this much fun since I collapsed a mineshaft on a whole tribe of kobolds." "I'm in." Kaelin nodded, her assent a simple, decisive gesture. "The strategy is sound. My troops will follow your instructions to the letter. It is an honor." She looked directly at Naruto, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something other than professional respect in her eyes. "To serve with a commander of your caliber." All eyes turned to Serafina. The high elf held Naruto's gaze for a long moment, her violet eyes searching his. She saw no arrogance, no lust for glory, only a quiet, unshakable determination. She had come here expecting to find a boastful, reckless brute. Instead, she had found a master strategist whose connection to the world around him bordered on the mystical. "My bow is yours," she said, her voice devoid of its earlier sarcasm. It was a simple statement, an oath. The plan was set. The council of war was over. As the women filed out of the barn to prepare their equipment and brief Kaelin's soldiers, Naruto remained behind. He walked to the barn's large, open doors and stared out at the night. The wind had died down, and the clouds had parted, revealing a cold, silver moon and a canopy of stars that were both alien and achingly familiar. He looked at the jagged silhouette of the mountains, a festering wound on the horizon. With a practiced, almost unconscious flick of his wrist, he formed a familiar hand sign. There was a soft puff of smoke, and standing beside him was a perfect replica of himself. The shadow clone, a simple technique, a habit he thought he had left behind in another world, another life. "You know what to do," he said quietly. The clone nodded, its expression as grim and determined as his own. It then flickered, disappearing into the night. A silent, unseen ghost heading towards the mountains for one final, personal reconnaissance. Naruto stood alone under the cold moonlight, the quiet farmer well and truly gone. The Sage King had returned. And with him, the heavy, familiar weight of a world that needed saving. His quiet life was a distant, bittersweet memory. The general was back on the field. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Stone. The world before dawn was a study in shades of gray and deep, bruised indigo. A biting, high-altitude wind, a stark contrast to the gentle breezes of the lowlands, whipped around the rocky outcrops of the mountainside, its voice a lonely, keening howl. It tore at the cloaks of the two figures who moved with an almost supernatural silence across the treacherous scree. Every loose stone, every jagged edge, was a potential betrayal, a sound that could carry for miles in the preternatural quiet of the peaks. Yet, they made no sound. They were ghosts against the stone, shadows moving with a purpose that was as sharp and cold as the mountain air itself. Naruto moved first, his steps as certain and silent on the shifting rock as if he were walking on a paved road. His senses were a vibrant, multi-layered tapestry of information. He felt the minute vibrations in the earth beneath his feet, tasted the subtle changes in air pressure that spoke of hidden crevices and sheer drops, and heard the frantic, terrified heartbeat of a snow hare hiding in a thorny bush 100 yards away. The mountain was not an obstacle to him, it was a living entity, and he was listening to its story. He wore no armor, only the same durable, dark-colored farmer's garb, yet he seemed utterly impervious to the gnawing cold. A thin, almost invisible film of golden chakra clung to his skin. A personal climate control system that was a trivial, almost thoughtless, application of his immense power. Following a few paces behind him was Serafina Vale. The high elf, a creature of the ancient forests, was far from her natural element, yet she moved with an inherent grace that was breathtaking to behold. Where Naruto's silence was a product of preternatural skill and sensory input, hers was one of instinct and racial memory. Her silver hair was bound tightly to keep it from whipping in the wind, and her violet eyes, accustomed to piercing the gloom of twilight woods, scanned the terrain with an intensity that missed nothing. She was, however, having to work for it. A faint sheen of sweat graced her brow despite the cold, a testament to the physical and mental exertion required to match her companion's impossible pace. Her skepticism had not vanished, but it had been transmuted into a state of focused, professional observation. She was watching a master at work, and the ranger in her, the part that revered skill and efficiency above all else, was deeply, grudgingly impressed. They were a study in contrasts. He was the embodiment of raw, contained power, a force of nature walking in the guise of a man. She was the pinnacle of refined, elegant lethality, an artist whose medium was the bow and the blade. He was grounded, earthy, his movements radiating a solid, unshakable confidence. She was ethereal, her steps light and fluid, as if she were only half tethered to the mortal coil. Yet, in their shared silence, in the rhythm of their ascent, a strange, unspoken harmony began to form. They reached the location Naruto had identified on his dirt map, a sheer cliff face that seemed utterly unremarkable. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost swallowed by the wind. Serafina saw nothing but rock. Naruto placed a hand on the cliff face, closing his eyes for a moment. "It's a clever illusion, not magical, natural, a thin rock shelf, disguised by centuries of mineral deposits." He pushed on a specific point, and a section of the rock, a massive slab weighing several tons, pivoted inward with a low groan of grinding stone, revealing a dark, yawning opening. The air that billowed out from the darkness was thick with the stench of something large, primal, and deeply unhygienic. From within the gloom, a low, guttural growl echoed, a sound that vibrated in their bones. Serafina's hand went instinctively to the quiver on her back, her fingers brushing the fletching of a black feathered arrow. "Wait," Naruto whispered, holding up a hand. He unslung the small satchel from his side. His shadow clone's reconnaissance had been thorough. He pulled out a cluster of large, phosphorescent mushrooms, their pale, ghostly light pushing back the oppressive darkness. He tossed the fungi into the cave. The growling stopped, replaced by a series of loud, enthusiastic slurping and munching sounds. Naruto stepped past the stone door and peered inside. Serafina followed, her bow now in her hand, the string taut. In the faint, otherworldly glow of the remaining mushrooms, she saw it. A cave troll, a creature of immense size and brutish strength, was happily stuffing the glowing fungi into its cavernous mouth, its single, massive eye glazed over with simple, gastronomic pleasure. It was so engrossed in its meal that it paid them no mind whatsoever. The beast could have torn them both limb from limb without effort, yet Naruto had neutralized it with a simple, calculated offering. It wasn't an act of a warrior, it was the act of a woodsman. A naturalist who understood the creatures of the world and chose to pacify rather than destroy when possible. This quiet display of wisdom, of choosing the path of least resistance, struck a deeper chord with the high elf than any feat of brute strength could have. "This way," Naruto said, gesturing towards a narrow fissure at the back of the troll's lair. "The vents are just beyond." The fissure opened into a vast, natural cavern, and the change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. The biting cold of the mountain peak was replaced by a humid, oppressive heat that felt like a physical weight. The air was thick with the acrid, nose-burning stench of sulfur. A network of geothermal vents crisscrossed the cavern floor, spewing clouds of thick, white steam that roiled and billowed in the darkness, creating a disorienting, hellish landscape. The only light came from the dull, red glow of magma visible through deep cracks in the rock. "The water in the main conduit is near boiling," Naruto stated, his voice echoing strangely in the vast, steamy chamber. "It will be uncomfortable." Before Serafina could question his sanity, a vibrant, golden aura erupted around him. It was not the thin, personal barrier he had used against the cold. This was a tangible, visible manifestation of his power, a shimmering cloak of energy that took on the vague, stylized shape of a fox with 9 flowing tails. The heat and humidity were instantly pushed back, creating a small, temperate bubble around them. "Stay close," he said, his voice now holding a strange, resonant quality. "The chakra will protect you from the heat." Quote. He stepped into the largest vent, a rushing torrent of superheated water that should have boiled the flesh from his bones. Instead, the water parted around his chakra cloak, hissing and spitting as it met the golden energy. He turned and offered a hand to Serafina. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, a blatant violation of the laws of nature. But she had seen him move mountains of stone and pacify trolls with mushrooms. The impossible, it seemed, was his stock in trade. She took his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, and surprisingly warm. As he pulled her into the vent, the golden chakra cloak expanded to envelop her as well. The sensation was utterly surreal. She was submerged in a rushing torrent of boiling water, yet she felt only a pleasant, comforting warmth. The world outside their golden bubble was a blur of steam and churning water. They were in the very heart of the mountain's fury, yet they were completely safe, cocooned in his power. The proximity was intimate. She was closer to him than she had been to any man in centuries, the raw, untamed power of his chakra a palpable presence that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, a calm and constant anchor in the chaos. For the first time, her analytical mind was silent, overwhelmed by the sheer, undeniable reality of the man beside her. The journey through the vents was a disorienting, claustrophobic ordeal that lasted for what felt like an eternity. Finally, they emerged into a small, dark grotto, the sound of the rushing water replaced by a slow, steady dripping. The air here was cool but stale, thick with the smell of filth, unwashed bodies, and despair. They had arrived. Naruto's golden cloak receded, plunging them back into darkness. Eyes and ears, he whispered, his voice once again a low murmur. My senses can pinpoint their locations. But I need you to watch for traps and patrols. Understood, she breathed, her own elven senses, now freed from the sensory overload of the vents, stretching out into the gloom. She saw LDC perfectly in the near-total darkness, her eyes adjusting to pick out the subtle textures of the rock, the faint gleam of moisture on the walls. They moved into a larger tunnel, and the true horror of the goblin nest was revealed. The walls were smeared with crude, terrifying symbols painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Piles of filth and gnawed bones were strewn carelessly about. Crude, rusted metal cages lined one wall, all of them empty, their doors hanging open like broken jaws. From deeper within the network, they could hear the high-pitched, cruel chittering of goblin voices, the crack of a whip, and a faint, muffled sob. A goblin patrol, a group of 5, rounded a corner, their crude spears held at the ready. They hadn't seen them. Naruto and Serafina flattened themselves into a shallow alcove, becoming one with the shadows. Serafina didn't wait for a command. She drew, knocked, and loosed an arrow in a single, fluid motion. The bowstring made no sound, a testament to elven craftsmanship. The arrow, a black feathered sliver of death, flew through the darkness and buried itself in the throat of the rearmost goblin, which crumpled to the ground without a sound. Before the other goblins could even register what had happened, Naruto exploded from the shadows. He was a blur of motion, a silent, deadly whirlwind. A knife hand strike to the neck of one, a precise jab to the temple of another. He moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency, each movement designed for a single purpose, to extinguish life as quickly and quietly as possible. In less than 3 seconds, the entire patrol was dead, their bodies arranged in a way that, to a casual glance from down the tunnel, they might appear to be resting. They dragged the bodies into the alcove, their teamwork seamless, unspoken. As they worked, Serafina's eyes fell upon something half buried in the filth on the tunnel floor. It was a small, crudely carved wooden doll, its dress torn, one of its button eyes missing. A child's toy. A wave of cold fury washed over her, a feeling she had not experienced with such intensity for a very long time. Naruto saw it too. His movements faltered for a second, his hands freezing on the goblin he was moving. The world around him seemed to dissolve, the dank, filthy tunnel replaced by a landscape of utter devastation. He was standing in the ruins of a village, the air thick with the smoke of burning homes and the metallic tang of blood. He saw the bodies of men and women, shinobi and civilians alike, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. And in the dirt, lying next to the small, outstretched hand of a little girl, was a familiar, worn-out plush frog wallet. His own, a gift from a lifetime ago. A memory of failure, of not being strong enough, not being fast enough. You promised you'd protect everyone. Naruto, you promised. The voice, a ghostly echo from his past, whispered in the back of his mind. Naruto. Serafina's voice, sharp with concern, cut through the haze of his memory. He blinked, the horrifying vision receding, the goblin tunnel snapping back into focus. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, his guard was completely down. She saw not the confident Sage King, not the master strategist, but a man drowning in a sea of ancient, unimaginable pain. The sheer depth of the sorrow in his eyes was a physical blow. It was a look she had seen before. In the eyes of elven veterans who had lived through the War of the Gods, a soul-deep weariness that came from witnessing too much death, too much loss. He quickly masked it, his calm, unreadable expression sliding back into place like a steel door. Nothing, he said, his voice a little too rough. Let's move. The prisoners are this way. I can feel their pain. He turned and moved deeper into the tunnels, his pace faster, more urgent. Serafina followed, her mind racing. The man was an enigma, a walking contradiction. A being of godlike power who chose to live as a farmer. A brilliant general haunted by ghosts she couldn't begin to comprehend. Her mission was to eliminate the goblin threat. But as she followed the broad-shouldered man through the suffocating darkness, a new, far more personal objective began to form in her mind, to understand the man named Naruto Uzumaki. They pressed on, the sounds of the goblin horde growing louder. As they rounded a corner, preparing for another silent takedown, a new sound reached them. It was a heavy, rhythmic stomping, a sound that shook the very stone beneath their feet. It was accompanied by a low, guttural chanting, a language far more ancient and complex than the crude chittering of goblins. Naruto pulled Serafina back into the shadows, his body shielding hers, his expression grim. That's not goblins, he whispered, his sage senses flaring, analyzing the new threat. That's something else, something much, much worse. The path to the prisoners was just ahead, but it seemed they now had a new, and far more formidable, gatekeeper. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. The Heart of the Hive and the Forge of Souls. The narrow, refuse-choked tunnel opened abruptly into a space that was an affront to the natural world. It was a vast, cathedral-like cavern, its ceiling lost in a swirling vortex of shadow and steam that rose from fissures in the chamber's floor. The oppressive, damp chill of the tunnels was gone, replaced by a dry, suffocating heat that radiated from crude iron braziers mounted on stalagmites, their flames casting a grotesque, dancing light of sickly orange and acrid black smoke. The air was thick with the coppery tang of old blood and the low, vibrational thrum of a dark ritual in progress. This was not a living space, it was a temple of desecration, a nexus of pain carved into the very heart of the mountain. And in its center, its back to them, stood the gatekeeper. The rhythmic, ground-shaking stomping they had heard from the tunnel was the creature's idle pacing, each heavy foe ought fall a hammer blow against the stone floor. It was a monster born from a mad god's fever dream. It stood a full 12 feet tall, a horrifying fusion of goblinoid cunning and ogre-like brute force. Its skin was a mottled, gangrenous green, stretched taut over a frame of impossibly dense muscle and bone. Crude plates of blackened, scavenged iron were bolted directly into its flesh, a gruesome mockery of a knight's armor. In its massive, three-fingered hands, it gripped a colossal axe, its blade a jagged, serrated wedge of rusted metal that looked more like a tool for demolition than a weapon of war. This was the ogre-bound hobgoblin lord, and its very presence warped the air around it, a physical manifestation of brutal, absolute power. Flanking the creature, and the source of the low, guttural chanting, were two goblin shamans. They were wizened, ancient things, their bodies draped in rags and adorned with the bones of their victims. Their staffs, gnarled pieces of dark wood topped with humanoid skulls, pulsed with a sickly green light that flowed in shimmering, ethereal tendrils towards the hobgoblin lord, binding it, empowering it, focusing its rage. This was the linchpin of the nest's inner defense, a living, breathing failsafe. Naruto and Serafina pressed themselves into the shadows of the tunnel entrance, the sheer, unexpected scale of the threat a cold shock. Naruto's sage senses, which had provided him with a near-perfect map of the nest, had not registered this. The creature and its handlers were cloaked in a powerful, nullifying aura, a dead spot in his sensory perception. It was a trap, An ambush designed for any who managed to bypass the outer defenses. This realization didn't bring fear, but a cold, razor-sharp clarity. The game had changed. By the first trees, Serafina breathed, her voice a barely audible whisper against Naruto's ear. He could feel the tension thrumming through her body, a tightly coiled spring of disbelief and professional fury. Such a creature, its creation is a perversion of life itself. We cannot pass it unseen. Its senses are too keen. Her elven eyes, sharp as they were, saw the tactical nightmare before them. The chamber was a kill box, with little cover and only one path forward. Naruto remained silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping the chamber, his mind a whirlwind of calculation. He was not just seeing the monster, he was dissecting it. He saw the slight imbalance in its stance, the way it favored its left leg. He saw the strained, unnatural bulging of the muscles where the shaman's magic flowed into it. Points of immense power but also of critical weakness. He saw the patterns in the steam rising from the floor, noting the air currents. He wasn't looking for a way to fight it, he was looking for the perfect, irrefutable way to end it. He turned his head slightly, his lips almost brushing her ear as he spoke, his voice a low vibration that traveled through her as much as she heard it. You are correct, we cannot pass it, so we will remove it. The shamans are the key. They are maintaining the binding. Without them, it will be diminished, disoriented. But they are shielded by its rage. I will create an opening. A single, perfect moment. You will not have a second chance. Can you make the shots? There was no boast in his question, no challenge. It was a simple, professional inquiry between two masters of their craft. Serafina's violet eyes narrowed, a predatory gleam igniting in their depths. The initial shock had been replaced by the cold focus of the huntress. Give me the moment, she whispered back, the words an oath. The rest is mere physics. Naruto gave a single, sharp nod. He formed a hand sign, a blur of fingers hidden in the shadow of his cloak. A foot away from him, a perfect, silent replica of himself, a shadow clone, materialized from the darkness. The clone pressed its hands together, and a small, almost invisible sphere of swirling wind began to form in its palm. A Rasengan, but silent, contained, stripped of its usual roaring sound. The original Naruto then moved. He was not a blur of speed, but a flowing of shadow, melting from their hiding place and circling around the chamber's edge. Using the rising steam and the deep shadows cast by the braziers as his personal cloak. Serafina held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. He moved with a level of stealth that defied elven senses, a feat she would have considered utterly impossible moments before. He was not just hiding in the shadows, he was the shadow. The clone, from its position at the tunnel mouth, completed its task. It didn't throw the Rasengan. Instead, it gently touched the silent sphere to the rock wall. There was no explosion, no sound, only a rapid, violent erosion. Action of the wall the size of a man's head simply dissolved into dust, which was then immediately scattered by the chamber's air currents. But the vibration, a sharp, high-frequency shockwave that traveled through the stone, was all that was needed. The hobgoblin lord's head snapped towards the source of the disturbance, its piggish eyes narrowing with suspicion. It took a thunderous step in that direction, raising its massive axe. Its body momentarily eclipsing the light from one of the braziers, plunging the two shamans into deep shadow. That was the moment. It was a window of opportunity that lasted less than a heartbeat. For Serafina, it was an eternity. Her bow was already drawn, two black feathered arrows knocked on the string. There was no conscious thought, only the pure instinct. Culmination of centuries of practice. The bowstring sang a single, muted note. The two arrows flew as one, silent messengers of death. They did not fly straight. They curved, guided by the subtle eddies and currents of air within the chamber, a feat of archery that was less a skill and more a form of high art. The first shaman never knew what hit him. The arrow entered his left eye socket, punching through to his brain. His guttural chant cut off with a wet gurgle. The second shaman, alerted by the sudden cessation of his partner's ritual, turned his head just in time to see the second arrow. It struck him in the throat, severing his vocal cords and his spine in the same instant. He crumpled to the ground, his staff clattering on the stone, the sickly green light sputtering and dying. The effect on the Hobgoblin Lord was immediate and catastrophic. The ethereal tendrils of magic binding it vanished. The creature roared, a sound of pure agony and confusion, as the raw, untamed power that had been forced into its body was suddenly unleashed without guidance. Its muscles convulsed, the iron plates bolted to its skin, groaning and tearing at its flesh. It was a rabid beast, its focus lost, its mind a maelstrom of pain. And into that maelstrom stepped Naruto. He emerged from the shadows directly in front of the raging creature, a calm, implacable figure against a backdrop of berserk fury. The Hobgoblin Lord swung its axe, a wild, sweeping arc that should have cleaved him in two. The wind from the blow alone was a physical force, kicking up dust and debris. But Naruto was no longer there. He had dropped low, flowing under the swing with a liquid grace, and came up inside the creature's guard. He moved with a brutal, devastating precision. His right hand, glowing with a faint blue chakra, slammed into the creature's knee joint. There was a sickening crack, louder than a thunderclap in the vast chamber, as bone and sinew shattered. The monster's leg buckled, and it staggered, roaring in renewed agony. As it fell, Naruto was already moving, running up the creature's outstretched arm as if it were a ramp. He reached its chest just as it tried to right itself. In his palm, a swirling, perfectly formed sphere of pure, concentrated chakra roared into existence, a full-sized Rasengan. He didn't hesitate. He drove it directly into the creature's chest, into the crude breastplate that served as its armor. Rasengan, he bellowed, his voice the first loud sound he had made, a raw, primal war cry that echoed through the cavern. The impact was not an explosion, it was an annihilation. The breastplate didn't just break, it atomized. The sphere of chakra ground into the creature's flesh and bone, a miniature, unstoppable hurricane that shredded muscle and pulverized organs. The Hobgoblin Lord's roar was cut short, its eyes wide with a brief, fleeting moment of shocked understanding before the light faded from them. The massive body was thrown backward, lifted from its feet by the sheer kinetic force of the attack, and slammed into the far wall of the chamber, where it hung for a moment before sliding to the floor in a broken, lifeless heap. Silence descended, thick and absolute. The only sounds were the crackling of the braziers and the faint, steady dripping of water from the cavern ceiling. Naruto landed lightly on the stone floor, his breathing even, the Rasengan in his hand vanishing as if it had never been. He stood over the corpse of his enemy, his expression grim, his cerulean eyes cold as ice. Serafina emerged from the tunnel in trance, her bow still in hand. Her face a mask of stunned awe. She had seen warriors of incredible skill in her long life. She had witnessed champions of legend perform feats of impossible heroism. But she had never seen anything like this. This was not a fight. It was an execution, a perfect, brutal symphony of stealth, strategy, and overwhelming power. The sheer, terrifying gap between this man and everything she had ever considered powerful was a chasm too wide to comprehend. Naruto glanced at her, and the cold warrior receded, replaced by the focused commander. "The way is clear," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The prisoners are just beyond this chamber. Prepare yourself. What we are about to see will not be easy." He was right. The chamber of the gatekeeper was a temple of violence, but the corridor beyond led to a circle of hell that was infinitely worse. The air became thick, foul, a nauseating miasma of sweat, feces, and a cloying, metallic scent that could only be blood. The sounds of goblin revelry were replaced by the sounds of human suffering, the low, agonized moans of the dying, the hopeless, broken weeping of the lost, the thin, terrified whimpers of children. They entered the prison block. It was a series of large, interconnected caves, dimly lit by sputtering torches that seemed to suck the very light from the air. Along the walls were massive, rusted iron cages, rammed so full of people that there was barely room to move. The floors of the cages were a carpet of filth and straw. The prisoners, a mix of humans, dwarves, and a few elves, were skeletal, their bodies covered in sores and bruises. Their eyes hollowed out by starvation and despair. The men were broken, their bodies scarred by forced labor. The women were in a state of living death, their clothes in tatters. Their spirits utterly shattered by the unspeakable, constant violation that was a goblin's favorite pastime. Naruto's face became a mask of stone, but Serafina could see the storm raging in his eyes. A cold, silent fury that was more terrifying than any shout. This was the source of his haunted look. This was the abyss he had stared into before. He moved to the first cage, his hands gripping the thick, rusted bars of the door. He didn't bother with the lock. He simply pulled. The sound of groaning, protesting metal filled the cavern as the iron bars bent outward, the lock shattering under the impossible strain. He tore the door from its hinges and cast it aside with a contemptuous crash. He moved to the next cage, and the next, his movements efficient, methodical. A one-man liberation force fueled by righteous wrath. Serafina, meanwhile, felt a coldness spread through her limbs that had nothing to do with the cavern's temperature. Her elven heart, which beat in tune with the life of the world, felt only a deep, profound sickness here. This was a blight, a cancer. She saw the elven prisoners, their slender frames even more gaunt than the humans, their pointed ears drooping in shame and defeat. She approached them, her bow vanishing onto her back, her hands empty. She began to speak, her voice low and soft, a stream of ancient Elvish that was like a spring rain on a parched and broken land. She offered them not orders, but comfort, a reminder that they were not forgotten, that they were still the proud, long-lived people of the forest. It was in the last cage, tucked away in the darkest corner of the prison, that they found her. A small elven girl, no older than 10 by elven reckoning, which made her a mere toddler in the eyes of her people. She was huddled in the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her large, almond-shaped eyes wide and completely vacant. She was catatonic, locked away in a place in her mind where the monsters could not reach her. She was clutching the small, crudely carved wooden doll Serafina had seen in the tunnel. Serafina's breath hitched in her throat. Her carefully constructed composure, the stoicism of a centuries-old ranger, crumbled into dust. She knelt before the cage, tears welling in her violet eyes, a single, perfect drop tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. This child was the living embodiment of all the horror in this place. Naruto fell silent, his work of liberation forgotten for a moment. He came and stood behind her, placing a large, comforting hand on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In that simple, grounding touch, she felt a shared understanding, a deep and resonant empathy that transcended words. He knew this pain. He had carried it himself. He then moved past her and knelt before the little girl. He did not reach for her. He did not speak. He simply held out his hand, palm up. A soft, warm, golden light began to glow in his palm. The light coalesced, shifted, and took the form of a small, exquisitely detailed butterfly. It flexed its wings of pure light, then lifted from his palm and fluttered through the bars of the cage. It circled the little girl's head once, twice, before landing gently on the wooden doll in her hands. For the first time, the little girl's eyes moved. They tracked the butterfly. A flicker of something, curiosity, wonder, a ghost of a long-forgotten memory of sunlight, danced in their vacant depths. Her small, trembling fingers reached out, hesitating, before gently touching one of the butterfly's glowing wings. The moment her skin made contact, a wave of warm, soothing chakra flowed from the construct into her, a gentle, calming tide against the raging ocean of her trauma. A single, silent tear rolled down the little girl's cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. Serafina watched, her own tears now flowing freely. She was witnessing not an act of power, but an act of profound, gentle kindness. In this place of ultimate darkness, he had created a small, perfect moment of light. The Sage King, the master strategist, the unstoppable warrior, was also a healer of broken souls. Her respect, her admiration, it was all swept away by a sudden, fierce, and utterly overwhelming wave of emotion that she could not, and did not want to, name. Miles away, on the windswept eastern flank of the mountain, Sword Maiden stood like a statue carved from alabaster, her eyes closed, her hands clasped in prayer. The wind whipped her golden hair and white robes around her, but she remained perfectly still. An island of serenity in the brewing chaos. She was not praying for victory. She was praying for the soul of the man who had willingly descended into the darkness that had so nearly consumed her own. She knew what he would find in that nest. She knew the horrors that awaited him, and her heart ached with a shared, empathetic pain. "He'll be fine," You know, a gruff voice said from beside her. Brunhild stood with her feet planted wide, her arms crossed, her expression one of grim satisfaction as she watched the distant main gate of the goblin nest. The lad's tougher than a dragon's hide. Worry about our part. It is not his strength I worry about, Brunhild, Sword Maiden replied, her voice soft but clear over the howl of the wind. It is his soul. Power of that magnitude carries a terrible weight. Each life he takes, no matter how foul, leaves a scar. I pray he does not lose himself in the darkness he has chosen to confront. HMPH. Better his soul be scarred than our bodies be ripped apart, came the terse, practical reply from her other side. Kaelin Ironhand stood, her hand resting on the pommel of her sword, her gaze fixed on the mountain with the unblinking focus of a hawk. Our objective is to create the diversion. All troops are in position. We await the signal, or the appointed time. Whichever comes first. The time came. With a sharp nod from Kaelin, the performance began. Brunhild let out a thunderous war cry that was more dwarven fury than priestly prayer. She lifted her massive warhammer and slammed it against a large, flat boulder on which she hastily inscribed a series of powerful runes. The runes flared with a brilliant, earth-brown light, and the very mountain seemed to groan. 100 yards up the slope, an illusion of a massive rockslide began. Tons of spectral boulders crashing down the mountainside with a deafening roar, shaking the very foundations of the goblin's fortress. At the same time, Sword Maiden raised her hands to the sky. Oh, Supreme One, let your light be a beacon of terror to the creatures of the dark. She incanted. Pillars of pure, searing white light erupted from the ground in front of the main gate, exploding in silent, blinding flashes that mimicked a powerful magical bombardment. Below them, Kaelin's 50 soldiers, the main body of their small force, began their part. They did not advance. They held their position and created a cacophony of sound, beating their swords against their shields, shouting war cries, sounding horns, all of it amplified and echoed by the mountain's strange acoustics. The effect was instantaneous. From their vantage point, they saw the main gate of the goblin nest vomit forth a tide of green-skinned creatures. Hundreds, then thousands, of goblins poured out, their crude weapons held high. Their shrieks of rage and confusion echoing up the mountainside. They swarmed towards the source of the light and sound, a chaotic, disorganized mob, utterly convinced that a massive army was preparing to lay siege to their home. The feint was working perfectly. Sword Maiden watched the tide of monsters, her face grim. They had drawn the anger of the hive. Now, she could only pray that the man inside had succeeded in his task. He had. Naruto's plan, audacious as it was, unfolded with a beautiful, terrifying precision. Getting the prisoners out was the next, most dangerous, phase. There were nearly 60 of them, most too weak to walk unaided. He gathered them all in the now empty prison block. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and commanding, yet imbued with a calming energy that cut through their fear. I am getting you out of here. But you must do exactly as I say. You must be silent. You must not panic. No matter what you see or hear, you must trust me. He brought his hands together in a familiar seal. Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. In a series of soft pops of smoke, 24 shadow clones appeared. The prisoners gasped, some recoiling in fear at the sudden appearance of so many identical men. The clones, without a word, began to gently lift the weakest prisoners, their movements firm but careful. Now for the hard part, Naruto said to Serafina. He closed his eyes, focusing his immense chakra. Henge no Jutsu. It was not the simple transformation of a single person. It was a jutsu on a scale that was simply unimaginable. A massive, complex illusion that settled over the entire group. Naruto, Serafina, the clones, and all 60 prisoners. Their forms flickered and blurred. Their scent changed, from the human smell of sweat and fear to the goblin smell of filth and refuse. The sounds they made were muffled, altered, twisted into the shuffling and grunting of a goblin work party. To any outside observer, they were now nothing more than a large group of goblins hauling sacks of waste through the tunnels. The journey back was the most nerve-wracking experience of Serafina's life. They passed several goblin patrols, creatures drive on from the inner depths by the commotion from the east. The goblins would sneer at them, shout crude insults at the filth haulers, but they didn't look twice. The illusion was perfect, absolute. Serafina walked beside the real Naruto, who was carrying the catatonic elven child in his arms. She could see the strain on his face in the flickering torchlight, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. Maintaining an illusion of this scale and complexity, while simultaneously commanding 24 clones and navigating the treacherous tunnels, was a feat of endurance that bordered on the divine. Yet his expression remained calm, his presence a solid, unshakable anchor for the terrified survivors around them. Her heart, a thing she had thought long dormant and protected by a wall of elven stoicism, ached for him, with him. They finally reached the troll's cave. The beast was snoring loudly, surrounded by the faint, glowing remnants of its mushroom feast. Just outside, hidden in the pre-dawn gloom, was the squad of 10 elite soldiers Kalen had dispatched, their faces grim and determined. They were shocked into silence by the sheer number of prisoners that emerged from the cave mouth. The handoff was swift and efficient. Naruto's clones helped move the prisoners, delivering them into the soldiers' care. Naruto himself gave the squad leader a series of rapid-fire instructions. They are severely dehydrated and malnourished. Water first, then a thin broth. Nothing solid. Many of the women will need healers who specialize in psychological trauma as much as physical. Get them to the village. Brunhild will know what to do. He gently handed the small elven girl to a female soldier, who held the child with a surprising tenderness. Before he let go, he looked into the girl's still vacant eyes. "You're safe now," he whispered, a promise and a blessing in one. "The monsters are gone." For the briefest of moments, the girl's fingers tightened on his tunic, a flicker of conscious response. Before she was whisked away into the night. As the last of the soldiers and survivors disappeared down the mountainside, Naruto finally let the illusion drop. He staggered slightly, a wave of chakra exhaustion hitting him. Serafina was instantly at his side, her hand on his arm to steady him. "You are spent," she said, her voice thick with concern. "You cannot possibly fight now." He straightened up, the moment of weakness passing as he drew on his immense inner reserves. He looked at her, and the warmth, the gentleness he had shown the child, was gone. His eyes were once again the cold, hard blue of a winter sky. He looked back towards the dark, gaping maw of the goblin nest, a place he now knew was stained with the souls of countless innocents. "We only rescued the living," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Now, we bring justice for the dead." The feint on the eastern flank has drawn out the swarm. The hive is in chaos. The heart is exposed. He turned to face her fully. The first rays of the rising sun breaking over the distant peaks, casting his face in a stark, unforgiving light. The Sage King was back, his rage a cold, contained inferno. "The diversions will only hold them for so long. Are you ready?" he asked, a ghost of a predatory smile touching his lips, to show them what a real storm looks like. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6. The Eye of the Storm. The first rays of dawn were a hesitant, watercolor wash of pale rose and soft gold against the bruised indigo of the retreating night. They touched the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the mountain range, bringing a cold, clinical light to the scene of their recent escape. The air, thin and sharp, was a clean, biting contrast to the foul, recycled breath of the goblin warren. It tasted of ice, stone, and the promise of a new, bloody day. For a long moment, the only sounds were the lonely cry of a high-altitude hawk circling in the updrafts and the whisper of the wind over the scree. They stood at the entrance to the troll's cave, two solitary figures silhouetted against the vast, indifferent majesty of the awakening world. Serafina watched Naruto with a tense, worried energy. The sheer scale of the power he had expended, maintaining a complex, multi-person illusion while simultaneously commanding 24 clones and navigating a hostile environment, was something the world had never seen. The brief stumble he'd made after releasing the jutsu was a more terrifying indicator of his power than any of his overt displays of strength. It meant he actually had limits, however impossibly vast they might be. He had pushed himself to that edge for the sake of those broken people. "You cannot go back in there," she stated, her voice losing its usual elven cadence, replaced by a blunt, human-like concern. "Not yet. You are drained. Even a demigod must rest." Naruto didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the dark, gaping maw of the cave, a wound in the mountainside that mirrored the wound in his own soul. He could still hear the weeping of the prisoners, feel the phantom weight of the catatonic elven child in his arms. Rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not while the architects of that suffering still drew breath. "There's no time," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The diversion won't last forever. Kalen's soldiers are brave, but they are mortals facing a tide of monsters. Every minute we wait is a minute they have to bleed for. And what use will you be to them if you collapse from exhaustion in the heart of their nest?" She countered, stepping in front of him, forcing him to meet her intense violet gaze. "A dead hero is just a tragic story. I would prefer a living, effective ally. You taught me about choosing the path of least resistance with the troll. Do not be so foolish as to choose the path of most resistance with yourself." Her words, logical and sharp, cut through the haze of his righteous fury. She was right. He was operating on reserves, his rage a potent but finite fuel. Going back in now would be reckless, a betrayal of the strategic mind that had brought them this far. He let out a long, slow breath, the frustration leaving him in a cloud of white mist in the cold air. "You're right," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He sank down into a cross-legged position on a flat, sun-warmed rock, his back to the cave entrance. He closed his eyes, his posture becoming unnaturally still. "I won't be long. I just need to listen." Serafina watched him, her brow furrowed in confusion. Listen. To what? The wind. He didn't answer immediately. The change that came over him was subtle, yet profound. The tense, coiled energy of the warrior bled away, replaced by an aura of absolute, unnerving tranquility. His breathing deepened, slowing until it was almost imperceptible. The lines of stress around his eyes and mouth softened. A faint, reddish-orange pigmentation began to appear around his eyes, extending outwards in sharp, angular markings. His irises, when he finally opened them, were no longer just blue. They were a brilliant, burning gold, and his pupils had become horizontal bars, like those of a toad. The effect was instantaneous and staggering. The very air around him seemed to thicken, to vibrate with a newfound energy. It was not the explosive, crackling power of his chakra cloak, but something deeper, older, more fundamental. Serafina felt it not as a threat, but as an overwhelming sense of presence. It was as if the mountain itself, the wind, the very stone beneath her feet, had suddenly focused its attention on the seated man. She could feel the life force of the hardy mountain grasses, the slow, patient existence of the lichens on the rocks, the deep, slumbering power of the earth itself, and she realized, with a jolt that went straight to her soul, that all of it was flowing into him. He wasn't just sitting on the mountain, he was communing with it, borrowing its strength, becoming one with its ancient, unyielding spirit. What is this?" she whispered, her voice filled with a reverence she hadn't felt since she was a young elf standing before the eldest trees of her homeland. "Sage mode," he answered, his voice a calm, resonant baritone that seemed to echo from the world around them rather than from his own throat. "It's difficult to explain. I'm gathering natural energy, the life force of the world itself. It replenishes me, it allows me to see, to hear, to feel things as they truly are." He looked at her, and his golden, toad-like eyes seemed to see right through her. Past the hardened exterior of the ranger, past the centuries of stoicism, and into the core of her being. She felt utterly exposed, not in a violating way, but in a way that was both terrifying and liberating. "The world is screaming," he continued, his gaze drifting back towards the goblin nest. "This place, it's a cancer. A pocket of death and decay that offends the natural order. It's not just the goblins. It's the one they serve. The one in the heart of the nest. It's a blight upon the life of this world." He fell silent again, his concentration absolute. Serafina simply watched, a silent sentinel. The legendary summoned hero her people spoke of in their histories was said to have wielded the power of the heavens, of fire and lightning. But this was different. This was the power of the earth itself. A power that was both more subtle and infinitely more profound. The man before her wasn't a weapon forged by the gods, he was an avatar of the living world, and she was beginning to understand that the goblins had not just incurred the wrath of a powerful man. They had earned the enmity of the planet itself. The process took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The orange markings around his eyes deepened, solidified. He took a deep breath, and when he opened his eyes again, they were back to their normal, cerulean blue, but they shone with a renewed, vibrant intensity. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a calm, focused energy that was 10 times more potent than before. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. "Thank you," he said, and he knew he wasn't just thanking her for her advice, but for her patience, for her trust. Now, the real work begins. He turned to face the cave. "This time, we are not the whispers in the dark. We are the thunder and the lightning. We are the storm. Stay behind me, and pick your targets. We're going to tear the heart out of this mountain." Without another word, he stepped back into the darkness. Serafina nocked an arrow, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a fierce, exhilarating thrill. She had come to this mountain to hunt goblins. She was now following a living force of nature into the depths of hell itself. And there was nowhere else in the world she would rather be. Their re-entry was a cataclysm. The first chamber, where the troll had been, was now occupied by a score of hobgoblins. Their brutish faces twisted in confusion and rage, trying to organize a search party. They didn't even have time to register the threat. Naruto appeared in the tunnel mouth, a blur of motion. He didn't stop, he didn't hesitate. He thrust his right hand forward, a swirling sphere of pure, blue energy, the Rasengan, materializing in his palm. He slammed it into the chest of the foremost hobgoblin. The impact was a dull, wet thud, and the creature simply ceased to exist, its torso and the 3 hobgoblins behind it torn apart by the spiraling vortex of chakra. As the other monsters stared in shock, Naruto was already moving. He flowed through them like water, a dance of brutal, efficient violence. His fists and feet were a blur, each strike landing with the force of a battering ram. A palm heel to the jaw of one hobgoblin sent it flying backward, its neck snapping with an audible crack. A sweeping leg kick took out 2 more at the knees. He moved through the chaos with a chilling, detached precision. His sage-enhanced senses giving him a perfect, 360-degree awareness of the battlefield. He didn't need to see the spear thrust from behind him. He felt the disturbance in the air, the killing intent of his attacker. He spun, grabbing the spear shaft, and used the hobgoblin's own momentum to pull it forward, driving his knee into its face with a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. While he was the whirlwind at the center of the storm, Serafina was the lightning that struck from its edge. From the relative safety of the tunnel entrance, she became a machine of silent, lethal archery. Her bow sang its deadly song, each arrow a punctuation mark in Naruto's symphony of destruction. A goblin shaman, trying to weave a curse from the back of the room, suddenly found its spell-casting hand pinned to the rock wall by a barbed, black-feathered shaft. A hulking hobgoblin, raising a club to smash Naruto from the side, let out a gurgling shriek as an arrow materialized in its eye socket. She was not just killing. She was controlling the battlefield, eliminating threats before they could fully form, protecting his flanks, ensuring his rampage could continue unabated. Their synergy was perfect, a deadly duet of overwhelming force and precise, surgical strikes. In less than a minute, the chamber was silent, the floor littered with the broken bodies of 24 elite goblinoids. Naruto stood in the center of the carnage, not even breathing heavily. "More are coming," he stated, his eyes already focused on the tunnel leading deeper into the nest. They felt that. He was right. A deep, guttural roar echoed from the depths, the sound of the hive being stirred into a frenzy. They didn't wait. They plunged deeper, Naruto leading the charge. They entered the main thoroughfare, a wide, long tunnel that sloped steeply downwards, and were met with a tidal wave of green flesh. Hundreds of goblins, their eyes glowing with red, feral light, surged up the tunnel towards them, a chittering, screeching horde of primal hatred. "This will be messy," Naruto grunted. He brought his hands together in a familiar seal. Wind release. Great breakthrough. He took a deep breath and exhaled a hurricane. A massive, unstoppable torrent of wind erupted from his mouth, filling the entire tunnel. The goblins in the front rank were simply torn to shreds, their bodies flayed by the gale force winds. The ones behind them were lifted from their feet, a chaotic, screaming mass of bodies that were slammed against the tunnel walls and ceiling with bone-shattering force. The tunnel was cleared in a single, devastating blast. They advanced through the grotesque, wind-scoured tunnel, the air now thick with the smell of pulverized goblin. Serafina had to consciously stop herself from gaping. The sheer scale of that attack, it wasn't a spell. It was a force of nature, summoned at will. They fought their way downwards, a two-person army against a legion. Each chamber brought a new horror. And each horror was met with a new, terrifying solution from Naruto's arsenal. In a vast cavern crisscrossed by rickety rope bridges over a bottomless chasm, they were ambushed by goblin archers from all sides. Before Serafina could even begin to counter-snipe, Naruto created a dozen shadow clones. The clones leapt onto the ropes, their movements impossibly agile, and swarmed the archer nests. The ensuing carnage swift and brutal. In a flooded, sewer-like section, they were attacked by goblin-bred giant salamanders. Naruto simply walked on the water, drawing the beasts' attention, while Serafina, perched on a dry ledge, put an arrow through the eye of each one. Deeper still, they found the forges. It was a hellish, sweat-soaked cavern filled with the rhythmic clang of hammers and the roaring of crude furnaces. Here, goblin smiths and their hobgoblin overseers were crafting the crude, serrated weapons used by the horde. The place was defended by goblins wearing scavenged plate mail. Slow but incredibly durable. "My turn," Serafina said, a cold smile touching her lips. She swapped her normal quiver for a different one. Naruto created a diversion, a clone feigning an attack on the left flank. As the armored goblins turned their heavy shields, Serafina let fly. Her arrows were different now, their tips larger, strangely shaped. The first arrow struck a hobgoblin's shield. It didn't penetrate. Instead, the tip exploded in a small but powerful concussive blast, shattering the shield and stunning the creature. Naruto was there in an instant to finish it. The next arrow she fired hit the wall behind a group of 3 armored goblins. This one exploded with a cloud of thick, black, choking smoke. The goblins, blinded and disoriented, were easy prey for Naruto's taijutsu. They were an unstoppable force, a perfect blend of power and precision, each anticipating the other's moves, each covering the other's weaknesses. Amidst the slaughter, a strange, exhilarating bond was being forged between them. A connection tempered in the fires of battle and sealed in the blood of their enemies. On the eastern flank, the feint had become a desperate, grinding battle of attrition. The sun was now high in the sky, a merciless, indifferent eye that baked the blood-soaked ground. The initial tide of goblins had been chaotic, easy to manage, but now, a grim, brutal eye. Intelligence was beginning to assert itself. Hobgoblin champions were forming the smaller goblins into crude but effective phalanxes, using their numbers to try and overwhelm the small human force. "Shield wall. Hold the line." Kalen Ironhand's voice was a raw, commanding bark that cut through the din of battle. She stood just behind the front line of her soldiers, a rock of stability in a sea of chaos. Her armor was dented and spattered with green-black blood, but her stance was unwavering. Her soldiers, disciplined and brave, held their ground, a thin line of steel and courage against a seemingly endless tide. They fought in perfect unison, a testament to her training, their shields interlocked, their short swords stabbing out from the gaps. But they were tiring. For every goblin they cut down, 2 more seemed to take its place. "They're bringing up the heavies," Brunhild bellowed, her voice a mix of grim warning and dwarven glee. She pointed with her warhammer. 2 massive cave trolls, their skin thick as rock, their clubs the size of tree trunks, were being herded towards the human line by a group of hobgoblins. The trolls' roars were a physical blow, and the ground shook with their approach. The human soldiers' line wavered, fear finally beginning to break through their discipline. "Do not falter," Sword Maiden's voice rang out, clear and resonant as a temple bell. She stood on a small rise behind the main line, her white robes a stark, pristine contrast to the filth and carnage below. She held her holy symbol aloft, and it began to glow with a brilliant, golden light. "By the grace of the Supreme God, you were shielded, you were protected. Hold fast." A massive, shimmering barrier of golden light erupted in front of the shield wall. The first troll reached it and slammed its club against the barrier. The club bounced off with a deafening clang, the troll roaring in frustration. The goblins behind it surged forward, only to be repelled by the holy energy, their skin sizzling where they made contact. The barrier had bought them a reprieve, but Sword Maiden's face was pale with strain. Maintaining a ward of this size against such a sustained assault was draining her divine energy at an alarming rate. That won't hold him forever, lass. Brunhild shouted. Time for some dwarven diplomacy. With a war cry that could shame a dragon, she charged. She was not a defensive fighter. She was a whirlwind of righteous, earthy fury. She sprinted towards the second troll, which was trying to circle around the edge of Sword Maiden's barrier. The troll swung its club in a wide, sweeping arc that should have pulverized her. Brunhild didn't dodge. She slid, dropping low to the ground, and came up right between the troll's legs. She swung her rune-scribed hammer upwards with all the force of her stout dwarven body. The hammer, glowing with a faint, angry red light, connected with the troll's groin with a sound like a melon being struck by a meteor. The troll let out a high-pitched, gargling shriek that was almost comical, its eyes bulging as it dropped its club and clutched its wounded pride. Brunhild didn't give it a moment's respite. She scrambled up its back, her armored boots finding purchase on its thick hide, and slammed the head of her hammer into the base of its skull again and again, each blow accompanied by a shouted dwarven curse. The troll staggered, fell to its knees, and then collapsed face first into the dirt, dead. One down, but the other was still hammering on Sword Maiden's barrier, cracks beginning to appear in the golden light. And as they were focused on the front, none of them saw the new threat until it was too late. From a previously unnoticed side tunnel, a new horror emerged. It was a goblin lord, a creature, taller and more cunning than a hobgoblin, clad in masterwork, if stolen, plate armor, and wielding a massive, wickedly curved greatsword. And flanking it were a dozen goblin riders mounted on the backs of giant, snarling cave wolves. Their movements swift and predatory. They were a flanking force, and they were about to crash into the vulnerable side of Kaelin's line. To the flank, Kaelin roared, her professional calm finally breaking, her voice laced with desperation. Archers, focus fire. But it was too late. The wolf riders were too fast. They were about to tear her shield wall, and her entire force, to pieces. Deeper than deep, in the bowels of the mountain, Naruto and Serafina stood before two massive, obsidian doors, intricately carved with scenes of torture and dark worship. The air here was cold, still, and heavy with a palpable aura of ancient, malevolent intelligence. They had fought their way through the last of the nest's elite guards. The throne room, the heart of the hive, lay just beyond. This is it, Naruto said, his voice low. His sage senses were screaming at him. The power behind this door was immense, a suffocating presence that felt nothing like a goblin, an ogre, or a troll. It was something other. Whatever is in there, it's the source of all of this. Then let us put an end to it, Serafina said, her voice steady, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her bow. Naruto didn't bother trying the handles. He formed a Rasengan in each hand. Stand back, he warned. He slammed both spheres of spiraling energy into the obsidian doors. The ancient stone, which would have resisted any normal force, groaned, cracked, and then exploded inwards in a shower of black shrapnel. They stepped through the ruined doorway and into the throne room. The chamber was vast, circular, and lit by a single, eerie, pulsating crystal of sickly purple light that hung suspended from the ceiling. The walls were lined with niches, and in each niche was a glass container filled with fluid. And in each container was a developing, grotesque fetus, hybrids of goblins and other, unidentifiable creatures. In the center of the room, on a throne carved from the fused bones of 100 different species, sat the master of the nest. It was not a goblin. It was not a monster of flesh and blood. It was a robed figure, its face completely obscured by a deep, shadowed cowl. It was slender, almost delicate, and it sat perfectly still on its throne of bone, one long, pale, three-fingered hand resting on a gnarled, black staff. Floating in the air around its head were three glowing, blood-red crystals that pulsed in time with the larger one above. When it spoke, its voice was not a guttural roar, but a dry, sibilant, and unnervingly calm whisper that echoed in their minds rather than their ears. Less than so, the anomaly has arrived, greater than it said, the words dripping with ancient, intellectual contempt. Less than the tool that broke its creators. I have been watching you, Sage King. Your presence in this world is an interesting variable, a complication to be studied, and, ultimately, to be dissected. Greater than. It raised its free hand, and the air in the room crackled with an unseen power. Before them, the very stone of the floor began to ripple and churn, rising up, taking a new, horrifying form. The rock and bone coalesced into a massive, golem-like creature, a golem of fused agony. Its body a patchwork of screaming faces trapped in the stone. It let out a roar that was the combined anguish of 1,000 tortured souls. Naruto and Serafina stood back to back, weapons at the ready. They had fought their way to the heart of the hive, only to find that the true battle had just begun. Chapter 6 End. Chapter 7. The Abyssal Mind and the Raging Tide. The silence in the throne room was a physical entity. It was a cold, heavy blanket that smothered sound, a stark and terrifying contrast to the chaotic, blood-slicked tunnels they had just carved their way through. Here, in the sanctum of the enemy, the air was still, sterile, and thin, carrying the faint, clean scent of ozone and the subtle, vibrational hum of the pulsating purple crystal that served as the chamber's only illumination. The light it cast was not warm or welcoming. It was the color of a fresh bruise, a dead, analytical glow that seemed to strip the world of its vitality, rendering everything in shades of amethyst and encroaching shadow. This was a laboratory, a vivisection theater, and they had just interrupted the surgeon. The golem of fused agony stood before them, a monument to suffering given monstrous form. It was not a creature of flesh or even of simple magic. It was a geological nightmare, its body a compressed amalgam of the mountain's stony bones and the powdered, desecrated remains of 1,000 victims. Within its craggy, obsidian-like hide, Serafina could see them. The faint, ghostly outlines of screaming faces, their silent, eternal anguish trapped and weaponized. The golem's roar was not a sound made by lungs, but the psychic shriek of every soul whose essence was bound within its form, a chorus of despair that clawed at the edges of their sanity. Naruto planted his feet, a low, solid stance that rooted him to the desecrated floor. His sage-enhanced senses were a raging torrent of information. He could feel the unnatural lines of energy flowing from the cowled figure on the throne, through the 3 floating crimson crystals, and into the golem. It was a parasitic connection, a master-puppet relationship of absolute control. He also felt the seething, chaotic agony within the golem itself. A maelstrom of raw, negative emotion that gave the construct its terrifying, unpredictable strength. Serafina moved to his side, a silent shadow of silver hair and grim determination. She nocked an arrow, its broad, steel head designed for punching through armor, and drew the bowstring taut against her cheek. Her elven eyes, which could spot a hawk in the high clouds, narrowed as she analyzed the golem's form, searching for a chink, a seam, a point of structural vulnerability. She found none. It was a solid, seamless mass of hate and stone. Less than such vitality, greater than the ice of the abyssal mind echoed in their skulls, a calm, sibilant whisper that was somehow more menacing than any roar. It was a voice devoid of emotion, a sound of pure, dispassionate intellect. Less than you burn so brightly. A fascinating specimen, Sage King. The archives described your species as boisterous, an inadequate descriptor. You were a supernova contained in a shell of flesh. And you, greater than the focus of the telepathic voice shifted. And Serafina felt a cold, violating touch slide across the surface of her mind, like a spider skittering over her soul. Less than an elf, a species of remarkable longevity and regrettable arrogance. Your cellular structure is remarkably stable. A prime candidate for improvement. Greater than. Before Serafina could recoil from the mental intrusion, the golem of fused agony moved. Its motion was not the clumsy shuffling of a typical golem. It was a landslide, an earthquake given legs. It raised a massive, club-like arm and brought it crashing down where they stood. Naruto reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed Serafina by the waist, his grip like iron, and launched them both sideways with a burst of chakra from his feet. They landed in a roll 20 feet away as the golem's fist connected with the floor. The impact was a deafening, echoing crack that shook the entire chamber. The stone floor didn't just break, it shattered, spider webbing outwards, sending shards of rock flying like shrapnel. Serafina was already moving as they came out of the roll. She rose to one knee, her bow already aimed, and let her arrow fly. It streaked across the chamber, a sliver of vengeful steel, and struck the golem square in its chest. The impact produced a sharp clang, a shower of sparks, and nothing more. The arrow, forged to pierce dragon scales, shattered into a dozen pieces, its kinetic energy absorbed completely by the golem's unnatural hide. "It's too dense," she shouted, her voice tight with frustration as she nocked another arrow, this time one with a heavier, armor-piercing bodkin point. "Conventional attacks are useless. Less than conventionality is the mark of a limited intellect, greater than the abyssal mind commented, its tone that of a lecturer observing a failed experiment. The golem, unperturbed, turned its massive, featureless head towards them and began its inexorable advance. Naruto charged forward, a blur of motion. He wasn't aiming for the golem. He was testing it. He zipped to its left, then to its right. His movements too fast for a normal eye to track. The golem's head swiveled, its psychic senses tracking him perfectly. It swung its other arm in a wide, sweeping arc. A scythe of living stone that forced Naruto to leap backwards, the wind of its passage tearing at his clothes. "It's not tracking by sight or sound," Naruto called out, his mind racing, analyzing, dissecting. "It's tracking our life force. Our chakra." He created a dozen shadow clones in a flurry of smoke. The clones didn't attack. They scattered, running in every direction, filling the chamber with identical chakra signatures. The tactic, which had confounded countless skilled shinobi in his own world, had an immediate effect. The golem froze, its head twitching back and forth, its psychic senses momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden multiplication of targets. It was confused, less than a rudimentary application of energy division, greater than the abyssal mind observed, a flicker of something that might have been academic interest in its telepathic voice. Less than clever, in a brutish, biological fashion. But ultimately, a futile expenditure of resources. Greater than, as if in response to its master's will, the golem's form began to ripple. Its stony flesh churned, and a dozen thick, powerful tendrils of rock erupted from its back and shoulders. The tendrils lashed out, moving with a speed and precision that belied their size. Each one tracked and slammed into a shadow clone. The clones vanished in puffs of smoke, their brief existence terminated with brutal efficiency. The entire counter-tactic had lasted less than 10 seconds. Naruto and Serafina were now the only two targets left. The golem's full, terrifying attention was back on them. It was learning, adapting. "New plan," Naruto grunted, dodging Anyo. Their pulverizing blow that sent tremors through the floor. "We can't break it, so we have to unmake it. Serafina, its power is flowing from the throne. Can you see the energy lines?" Serafina's elven eyes, already seeing far more than a human could, narrowed further in concentration. She pushed her senses, trying to perceive the world on a level beyond the physical. And then, she saw it. Faint, almost invisible threads of sickly purple light, like ethereal puppet strings, running from the 3 crimson crystals floating around the abyssal mind's cowl, into the bone throne, and from there, converging into a single, thick cable of malevolent energy that anchored itself in the center of the golem's back. "I see them," she confirmed. "It's anchored to the throne. But the master is protecting it. I can't get a clear shot." It was true. The abyssal mind, though it had not moved from its seated position, was surrounded by a faint, shimmering distortion in the air, a psychic barrier that would likely deflect any physical projectile. Less than correct, little elf, greater than the voice whispered, laced with a condescending amusement. Less than the anchor is the source of its cohesion. You have identified the premise of the problem. But you lack the means to formulate a solution. This is the difference between a tool that simply functions, and a mind that truly creates. Now, demonstrate your futility for me. It is illuminating. Greater than. The golem renewed its assault, its movements now faster, more aggressive. It was no longer just trying to crush them. It was hurting them, forcing them away from the throne, controlling the battlefield with an implacable, brutal intelligence. Naruto was forced onto the defensive, his incredible speed and agility the only things keeping him from being smeared across the cavern floor. He was buying time, but for what? Serafina didn't know. Her arrows were useless. She was a sniper without a viable target, a liability in a close-quarters brawl. The frustration and sense of helplessness gnawed at her, a bitter, unfamiliar feeling. She was Serafina Vale, ranger of the Elder Woods, a warrior of centuries. And here, in this cold, dark place, she was little more than a spectator to a battle between gods and monsters. The world outside the throne room was not silent. It was a symphony of chaos, a cacophony of screaming metal, splintering bone, and raw, desperate war cries. The eastern flank of the mountain had become a charnel house, the ground a churned, bloody morass of mud and viscera under the unforgiving glare of the midday sun. Caitlin Ironhand's shield wall was a memory. Her disciplined line of soldiers was now a series of desperate, embattled pockets, fighting back to back against a tide of green that threatened to drown them. She parried a clumsy but powerful swing from a hobgoblin. Her longsword a blur of silver, and drove the point of her blade through the creature's unarmored throat in a single, fluid motion. She ripped the blade free with a wet, sucky-ing sound and spun to meet another attacker without missing a beat. Her breath came in ragged, burning gasps. Her arm, the one holding her shield, was a leaden weight, the muscles screaming in protest from absorbing 100 brutal blows. She could see the Goblin Lord, a hulking figure in black plate, moving through the battle like a butcher in an abattoir. His massive, curved greatsword rose and fell, each swing cleaving a man in two. Shield and all, he was the eye of the storm, the focal point of the goblin attack, and his presence had shattered her soldiers' morale. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive the next 10 seconds. Hold, she roared, her voice cracking with strain and desperation. Hold for the captain. But her words were swallowed by the din. Her men were dying, and she was powerless to stop it. The Goblin Lord finished his current victim, and its gaze, filled with a cunning, malevolent intelligence, fell upon her. It grinned, a horrifying sight of jagged, yellow teeth, and began to advance in her direction. Caitlin planted her feet, raised her battered shield, and prepared to meet her end. Duty and honor demanded nothing less. From across the battlefield, Brunhild roared. A sound of pure, concentrated dwarven fury. She had just caved in the skull of the second troll, her warhammer slick with blood and brain matter, and now she saw the plight of the knight captain. "I'm comin' for ye, ye pointy-eared git," she bellowed, her insult directed at the Goblin Lord, whose helmet had distinctly pointed, elven-like affectations. She was a force of nature, a cannonball of muscle and righteous anger, but she was too far away. Wolf riders, seeing her as the greater threat, swarmed around her, their mounts snapping and snarling, their riders jabbing at her with crude lances. She swung her warhammer in a wide, horizontal arc, a blow that would have felled an oak tree. The first wolf rider met the blow head-on. The sound was not a crack, but a wet, explosive crunch as wolf rider and lance were all obliterated in a spray of red mist. But two more took its place. She was a fortress, but she was a fortress under siege. High above the chaos, Sword Maiden stood on her small rise, her body trembling with exertion, her pristine white robes now stained with sweat and a splash of goblin blood. Her golden barrier had fallen, and the cost had been immediate and brutal. She saw Caitlin's desperate stand. She saw Brunhild's beleaguered fury. She saw the battle, the entire war, balanced on the edge of a knife. Her heart, a vessel of divine grace and compassion, was filled with a cold, terrible resolve. She had spent a lifetime healing, protecting, shielding. But her God was not just a God of mercy. He was a God of justice. And justice, sometimes, had to be delivered at the point of a sword of holy fire. She closed her eyes, shutting out the chaos, and focused her will, her faith, her very life force into a single, desperate prayer. Her hands, clasped before her, began to glow, not with the warm, protective golden light of her barrier, but with a white, searing incandescence that was as bright and merciless as the sun itself. The air around her grew thin, the temperature dropping as all the ambient energy was drawn into her spell. "Oh, Supreme One, Arbiter of light and shadow," she chanted, her voice, amplified by her divine power, cutting through the roar of battle like a clarion call. "Thy servants are beset by the darkness. Thy children cry out for vengeance. Grant me the strength to be thy vessel. Grant me the power to deliver thy righteous judgment upon the unholy." The sky above the Goblin Lord, which had been a clear, indifferent blue, began to darken. A small, swirling vortex of clouds appeared from nowhere, crackling with holy energy. The goblins around the Lord looked up, their jeers and war cries dying in their throats, replaced by whimpers of primal fear. The Goblin Lord itself looked up, its elegant eyes widening in something akin to shock. "Let the hammer of judgment fall." Sword Maiden screamed, her voice now raw, her arms thrust towards the sky. I offer my strength. I offer my will. Unleash thy sacred judgment. From the heart of the vortex, a pillar of pure, concentrated sunlight descended. It was not a gentle, warming light. It was a spear of incandescent, holy fire, a physical manifestation of divine wrath. It struck the Goblin Lord with a sound that was both a deafening thunderclap and a complete, absolute silence. For a moment, all color fled the world, replaced by an overwhelming, impossible whiteness. When vision returned, the Goblin Lord was still standing. But its black plate armor was glowing cherry red, melting and fusing to the flesh beneath. Smoke, thick and greasy, poured from the joints of its armor. It let out a choked, agonized shriek, a sound that was no longer a boastful war cry, but the death rattle of a damned soul. It took one staggering step, then another, before collapsing to its knees, and then pitching forward into the mud, its armor, and the creature within, flash cooked into a single, grotesque statue of ruin. The dozen wolf riders closest to it had simply vanished. Their bodies and mounts vaporized into ash and shadow. The battlefield fell into a stunned, momentary silence. The goblins, their champion and leader slain in an instant by a terrifying act of God, froze. Their primal bloodlust replaced by a wave of superstitious terror. On her hill, Sword Maiden swayed, the divine light fading from her. A thin trickle of blood ran from her nose. Her face was as pale as death, her reserves of divine energy utterly and completely spent. She sank to her knees, her vision swimming, the world dissolving into a gray, blurry haze. She had turned the tide. But she was now defenseless, a beacon of vulnerability in a field of monsters. Kaelin Ironhand did not waste the moment. The shock on her face was instantly replaced by the predatory instinct of a veteran commander. Now, she roared, her voice a rallying cry to her shocked and battered soldiers. For the captain, for the priestess, charge, drive them back to the hell they crawled from. Her words, and the sight of their seemingly invincible foe smoldering on the ground, broke the spell of fear that had gripped her men. With a renewed, desperate roar of their own, the hand full of remaining soldiers surged forward, a broken, but unbowed, line of steel. Kaelin led the charge, her sword held high, her eyes fixed on the now leaderless, panicked goblin horde. The goblins broke. Their fragile, bully's courage, which had been bolstered by their powerful leader, shattered completely. They turned and fled, a disorganized, screeching mob, trampling one another in their haste to escape the terrifying holy magic and the vengeful humans. Brunhild, seeing the charge, let out a booming laugh of pure, joyous relief. She brained the last wolf rider that was harassing her and spat on its corpse. That's how it's done, lass. She yelled in Sword Maiden's direction, before turning her attention to the remaining, now panicked, troll. Now, you ugly bastard. You and me, let's dance. She charged the last of the heavy units, her warhammer held ready, her spirit soaring with the thrill of a battle decisively won. The tide had not just turned, it had become a raging, cleansing flood. Back in the cold, sterile silence of the throne room, the tide was also beginning to turn. Naruto's mind, honed by a lifetime of impossible battles, worked with a speed and clarity that was truly superhuman. He analyzed the battlefield, the enemy, their own capabilities, and in a fraction of a second, he had the solution. It was a desperate, insane gamble, but it was the only path forward. Serafina, he called out, his voice sharp, commanding. He was no longer just her ally, he was her general. I need you to do something for me. I need you to draw its fire. All of it, for exactly 10 seconds. Can you do that? Serafina stared at him, her mind reeling. Draw the fire of that thing. A creature whose every blow could shatter solid rock. It was a suicide mission. But then she looked into his eyes. She saw no fear, no uncertainty, only a cold, absolute confidence. He had a plan. Her job was not to question it, but to execute her part in it perfectly. Her frustration and sense of helplessness vanished, replaced by a fierce, rekindled resolve. She was not a spectator. She was a key. 10 seconds, she said, her voice a low, steady oath. Consider it done. She slung her bow over her back. In a fight of pure evasion, it would only slow her down. She drew two long, wicked-looking fighting knives from the sheaths on her hips, her grip shifting into a reverse hold. She took a deep breath. And then she ran. She didn't run away. She ran towards the golem. Her movement was a blur of elven grace, a fluid, ground-eating sprint that was impossibly fast. She ducked under a sweeping blow from one of its tendrils. The rock scraping the air inches above her head. She leapt onto a piece of shattered flooring, using it as a springboard to launch herself into the air, twisting her body to avoid another lashing tendril. She was a dragonfly dancing in a rockslide, her every movement precise, economical, and breathtakingly risky. The golem, its simple, psychic mind focused on the most immediate and agile threat, turned its full attention to her. It ignored Naruto completely, its tendrils and fists now solely dedicated to crushing the impossibly fleet-footed elf who danced and weaved just beyond its reach. Less than a pointless display of acrobatic futility, greater than the abyssal mind commented, though for the first time, its telepathic voice held a faint, almost imperceptible trace of something other than calm disdain. Annoyance, perhaps, less than you cannot harm it. You can only delay your inevitable capture and dissection. Greater than. Serafina didn't hear it. She was in a state of pure, instinctual focus. The world had narrowed to the monster before her, the shifting floor beneath her feet, and the rhythm of her own breathing. 1 second. 2. She dodged a fist that would have turned her to paste. 3. 4. She slid under a sweeping attack, her knives scraping sparks against the stone. 5. 6. A tendril grazed her shoulder, tearing her tunic and leaving a deep, bleeding gash. The pain was a sharp, clarifying shock. She grit her teeth and kept moving. 7. 8. Naruto, forgotten by the golem and its master, had not been idle. He had thrust his hand into the small pouch on his belt and pulled out something that looked like a large, three-pronged dagger with a strange seal etched onto its handle. He channeled a sliver of his chakra into it. He closed his eyes. Hiraishin no Jutsu, the Flying Thunder God technique. A jutsu that had made his father a legend. A jutsu that bent the very fabric of space and time. A jutsu he had not used in years, for it was a tool of the battlefield. A relic of a life he had tried so desperately to leave behind. He vanished, not in a blur of speed, but in a silent, instantaneous flash of yellow light. 9. Serafina leapt backwards, avoiding a final, desperate lunge from the golem. 10. Her time was up. The golem reared back, all of its tendrils and both of its fists aimed at her, preparing a final, overwhelming barrage. She braced herself for the impact. She never felt it. In another flash of yellow light, Naruto reappeared. Not in front of her, but directly behind the bone throne, his special kunai now embedded in the wall just above the abyssal mind's cowled head. He was a silent, vengeful specter that had appeared out of thin air in the enemy's most secure sanctum. The abyssal mind's head snapped up, its calm, analytical demeanor finally shattering. For the first time, it radiated a genuine emotion, shock. Pure, undiluted shock, less than impossible. Spatial transposition of that velocity should not be possible for a biological entity. Greater than. Naruto ignored it. His hands were already a blur of motion, forming the hand signs for his final attack. He entered Sage mode in an instant, the golden light of natural energy flaring around him. The orange markings appearing around his eyes. He gathered the energy, pulling it from the very mountain itself, concentrating it into his right palm. "You like to experiment," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that was filled with all the rage and sorrow he had felt in the prison caves. "Then here's a new result for your data." He thrust his hand forward, not at the abyssal mind, but at the bone throne beneath it. A Rasengan, larger and more violent than any he had used before, roared into existence. It was not the pure blue of normal chakra. Infused with the raw power of nature, it was a miniature, golden sun. A swirling, raging vortex of life energy that was the absolute antithesis of the dead, parasitic magic that fueled the throne. Sage art. Rasengan. He slammed the golden sphere into the throne. The impact was not an explosion. It was an uncreation. The throne of fused bone, a nexus of necromantic energy, did not shatter. It vaporized. It was erased from existence in a silent, blinding flash of golden light. The three crimson crystals, their power source severed, shattered into dust. The thick, ethereal cable of purple energy connecting the throne to the golem snapped. Across the chamber, The golem of fused agony froze. Its form began to shudder, to crumble. The psychic roar of the thousand souls trapped within it changed from a scream of agony to a chorus of release. The golem dissolved, its stony form collapsing into a pile of black dust and inert rock, the ghostly faces within its form fading away with a final, peaceful sigh. The abyssal mind, its throne gone, now floated in the air. Its form flickering. The pulsating purple crystal on the ceiling cracked, its light dimming. Less than fascinating, greater than, it whispered, its voice now weak, laced with a genuine, almost breathless, curiosity. Less than. You have overloaded the power conduit. Destroyed the anchor. You have won. This time. But the experiment is not over. This vessel, this world, it is but one of many data points. Greater than. The cowled figure began to dissolve, not into flesh and blood, but into motes of purple light, the same light as the dying crystal above. Less than. We will meet again, Sage King. When we do, the parameters will be adjusted. Your emotional responses, your tactical improvisations, your unique energy signature, all have been recorded. We will have a great deal to discuss. Greater than. With a final, sibilant whisper that echoed in the silence. The Abyssinian mind vanished completely. The great crystal above them gave one final, violent shudder and then went dark, plunging the vast chamber into an absolute, suffocating blackness. The battle was over. They were left alone in the silent, ruined heart of the mountain, the silence now feeling not menacing, but empty. Triumphant. A soft, golden glow filled the darkness. It was Naruto, his sage mode aura providing a gentle, warm light. He looked across the chamber at Serafina, who was leaning against a rock, clutching her bleeding shoulder, her face pale but her eyes shining with a fierce, triumphant light. He walked over to her, the golden aura receding as he powered down. He reached her side and looked down at her wound. That was a foolishly brave thing you did, he said. His voice soft, devoid of its earlier rage. You asked for 10 seconds, she replied, a small, tired smile touching her lips. Elves are nothing if not precise. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed ridiculously out of place in the vast, dark chamber. He placed a hand gently over her wounded shoulder. A soft, green chakra, warm and soothing, flowed from his palm. Serafina watched, mesmerized, as the torn flesh began to knit itself back together, the pain receding, leaving only a pleasant, tingling warmth. In a matter of moments, the deep gash was nothing more than a faint, pink line. You are, she breathed, her violet eyes wide with wonder, a man of infinite surprises, Naruto Uzumaki. He gave her a tired, but genuine, smile. A smile that finally, truly, reached his eyes. We make a good team, he said, acknowledging her courage, her skill, her unwavering trust. He acknowledged her as his equal. In that moment, standing together in the ruins of their victory, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 dead monsters and the ominous promise of a new, cosmic war, a bond was forged between them that was stronger than steel and more resilient than any elven magic. It was a bond of shared survival, mutual respect, and the quiet, unspoken understanding of two warriors who had stared into the abyss together and had not blinked. The battle for the mountain was won. But for both of them, a new, far more complex, and infinitely more dangerous journey had just begun. Chapter 7 End. Chapter 8. The Quiet Earth. The dawn, when it finally broke over the high peaks, was an act of quiet, profound grace. It was a slow bleed of color, starting with a faint, hesitant line of saffron on the eastern horizon that gradually deepened into a rich, molten gold. As light spilled over the jagged teeth of the mountains, chasing the deep, bruised purples of the night from the valleys and casting long, dramatic shadows that were as sharp as cut glass. The air itself seemed to have been cleansed by the night's passage. It was thin, crisp, and so clean it was almost painful to breathe, a shocking, welcome contrast to the foul, recycled miasma of the Goblin Warren. It smelled of cold stone, distant ice, and the faint, resilient perfume of the hardy alpine flora. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the world was quiet. Naruto and Serafina stood at the mouth of the troll's cave, two solitary figures in a landscape of breathtaking, indifferent beauty. They were caked in grime, blood, and the filth of their enemies, yet the rising sun seemed to wash them in a light of pure, unblemished triumph. The adrenaline of the final battle had faded, leaving behind a deep, resonant ache in their bones and a profound, shared exhaustion that was more than just physical. It was the weariness of the soul that comes after staring into the abyss and forcing it to blink. Naruto leaned against the rock wall, his eyes closed, his face turned towards the nascent warmth of the sun. He was not meditating in his sage mode, he was simply feeling. Feeling the gentle kiss of the light on his skin, the clean bite of the wind, the solid, unyielding presence of the mountain beneath his feet. He was reconnecting himself to the living world, re-establishing the simple, grounding sensations that the cold, dead heart of the nest had tried to scour from him. Serafina watched him, her usual elven composure replaced by a quiet, unguarded vulnerability. Her shoulder, where the deep gash had been, was completely healed, yet a phantom ache remained, a physical reminder of the debt she now owed him. But it was more than a debt. In the throne room, she had placed her life in his hands with an absolute, unquestioning faith. It was a level of trust she had not then to another living being in over 300 years. The experience had forged a connection between them that was as tangible and unbreakable as the mountain itself. She saw him not as a summoned hero or a force of nature, but as a man who carried an impossible burden with a quiet, uncomplaining strength that humbled her. "The air," she said, her voice soft, the first sound to break the sacred silence. "I had forgotten what clean air smelled like." Naruto opened his eyes and gave her a small, tired smile. "It's easy to forget, when you're drowning." He pushed himself off the wall, his movements still fluid but lacking their earlier explosive energy. "Come on. The others will be worried. Kalen is probably trying to classify me as an unregistered siege weapon in her after-action report." A genuine, musical laugh escaped Serafina's lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. She would probably request a requisition form for you." The easy camaraderie felt strange, new, and incredibly precious. They began the descent, their pace steady and sure-footed, their earlier silence replaced by a comfortable quiet. They didn't need to speak of what they had endured. They had been witnesses to each other's strength, fear, and resolve. Words would only diminish the shared experience. They reached the eastern flank as the sun cleared the highest peaks, flooding the battlefield with a harsh, unforgiving light. The scene was one of grim, brutal victory. The ground was a churned, bloody testament to the ferocity of the battle, littered with the grotesque, green-black bodies of hundreds of goblins. The air was thick with the coppery stench of blood and the buzzing of early morning flies. Amidst the carnage, order was being forged from chaos. Kalen Ironhand, her armor a roadmap of dense and dried blood, was the calm, efficient center of this new order. She moved among her surviving soldiers, her voice a series of crisp, clipped commands, organizing the makeshift aid station for the wounded, dispatching patrols to secure the perimeter, and overseeing the grim but necessary task of counting the dead. She was no longer just a knight captain, she was a leader holding her small, battered army together through sheer force of will. When she saw Naruto and Serafina approaching, her stern, professional mask broke for a fraction of a second, replaced by a wave of profound, undisguised relief. "Report," she said, her voice rough with fatigue as they reached her. It was not a demand, but a plea for information. "The nest is empty. The leader is gone," Naruto said simply. The word, gone, seeming more appropriate than dead, for a creature like the abyssal mind. "The threat from the mountain is over." Kalen nodded, a deep, shuddering sigh of relief escaping her. She looked at Naruto, her gaze sweeping over his disheveled state, and for the first time, her analytical gaze held a note of something personal, something akin to awe. "Your diversionary tactics were unconventional, but effective. The capital will hear of this." Across the field, a booming, joyous, and slightly drunk-sounding roar echoed. "They're alive. By my grandmother's forge, the mad lad actually did it." Brunhild, her chainmail spattered with gore, her red braids askew, was striding towards them, her massive warhammer resting on her shoulder. She held a half-empty wineskin in her other hand, which she waved in their direction. "I knew you had it in you, lad. I'd offer you a drink, but you look like you could use a week of sleep more than a skin of cheap wine." Her boisterous energy was a welcome, grounding presence in the grim landscape. But as she got closer, her expression sobered as her gaze fell upon a small, quiet scene near the aid station. "The High Priestess," she murmured, her voice losing its usual bluster. Naruto's eyes followed her gaze. Sword Maiden was sitting on a makeshift cot, her back resting against a large boulder. She was deathly pale, a profound, soul-deep exhaustion etched into every line of her beautiful, sorrowful face. A thin, blood-stained cloth was held to her nose, and her pristine white robes were now sullied with the dirt and blood of the battlefield. The divine power she had unleashed, the act of God that had turned the tide of the battle, had taken a terrible toll. She looked fragile, breakable, a fallen angel amidst the carnage she had helped to create. Without a word, Naruto walked towards her. The other three women, the pragmatic knight, the boisterous dwarf, and the elegant elf, watched him go, a strange, unspoken tension filling the air between them. Serafina felt a sharp, unexpected pang in her chest. It was a complex, unwelcome emotion, a mixture of gratitude that he was going to help Sword Maiden, and a possessive, territorial sting that the focus of his incredible, gentle power was now being directed at another. She had just shared a life or death ordeal with him, and a selfish, primal part of her felt that his attention, his concern, should be hers alone. The feeling was as illogical as it was powerful, and it confused her. Naruto knelt before Sword Maiden. She looked up at him, her sky-blue eyes clouded with pain and fatigue. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "The Sage King returns," she whispered, her voice a faint, papery rustle. "Your plan was a success. The people are safe. You were the one who saved them," Naruto replied. His voice soft. "You turned the tide, but you burned too brightly. You've exhausted your divine reserves. You've strained the connection to your God." He reached out, his hand hovering over her forehead. "May I?" he asked, a simple courtesy that was a profound gesture of respect for her station in her person. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He gently placed his palm on her forehead. It was not the intense, targeted healing he had used on Serafina's physical wound. This was different. A soft, gentle, golden light, the color of a summer dawn, emanated from his hand. It was not his own chakra he was giving her, but something else. He was using his perfect mastery of natural energy to act as a conduit, a bridge. He was gathering the ambient life force of the quiet, recovering earth around them, the stubborn resilience of the mountain grasses, the patient strength of the ancient stone, the clean energy of the morning sun, and gently, carefully, feeding that pure, untainted energy into her, replenishing what she had so violently expended. The effect was subtle, but immediate. A faint touch of color returned to her cheeks. The trembling in her hands ceased. The deep lines of pain around her eyes softened. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, not of pain, but of profound, bone-deep relief. It was like a cool drink of spring water to a woman who had been dying of thirst in a vast, spiritual desert. She looked at him, and the gratitude in her eyes was a tangible thing, a light that shone brighter than any divine spell. Her faith was in her God, but it was this man, this stranger from another world, who had become the vessel of her salvation. In that moment, her admiration for the hero was eclipsed by a deep, resonant connection to the man. From a distance, the other three women watched this silent, intimate exchange. Kalen saw a combat medic of unparalleled skill, a strategic asset whose abilities extended far beyond the battlefield. Brunhild saw an act of profound kindness, a wielder of immense power who chose to heal as readily as he chose to destroy, and her dwarven heart, which valued strength and integrity above all else, was deeply impressed. Serafina saw a moment of gentle intimacy, a connection being forged that was different from her own, but no less powerful, and the strange, new ache in her chest intensified. When Naruto finally drew his hand back, Sword Maiden looked tired, but whole. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. I have no words to express my gratitude." "Rest," he said simply. "You've earned it." He stood up, but she reached out, her fingers gently closing around his wrist. "Wait," she said, a new, steely resolve in her eyes. "There is one last thing I must do. I must see it, with my own eyes. I must see the nest. I must know that the source of so much suffering, is truly gone." It was a plea, but also a demand. A need to confront the ghosts that had haunted her for so long. Serafina and Brunhild started to protest, but Naruto silenced them with a look. He looked down at Sword Maiden, into her clear, determined eyes, and he understood. This was not about tactics or strategy. This was about healing a wound that was far deeper than any physical injury. Pain, sometimes, needed a witness. I will take you, he said. The journey into the mountain was a somber, silent pilgrimage. Naruto led the way, with Sword Maiden leaning lightly on his arm for support, her strength still returning. They walked through the carnage he and Serafina had wrought, through the tunnels filled with the dead. But Sword Maiden did not flinch. She looked upon the broken bodies of the goblins not with fear or hatred, but with a strange, detached pity. They were monsters, yes. But they were also victims of the greater darkness that had twisted them into weapons. Naruto didn't speak. He offered no comforting words, no empty platitudes. He simply offered his presence, a solid, unshakable anchor in her sea of memory and trauma. He was a silent guardian, allowing her the space and the safety to finally confront her demons on her own terms. They reached the throne room. It was dark, silent, and cold. The great crystal now just a dead, black rock hanging from the ceiling. Naruto activated his sage mode just enough to create a soft, golden light to illuminate the chamber. He showed her the ruined throne, the shattered niches where the experiments had been grown, the dust that was all that remained of the golem. He showed her the empty heart of the hive. It's over, he said quietly. The mind that controlled them is gone. The darkness has been scoured from this place. Sword Maiden walked to the center of the room, her hand trailing over the cold, dead stone. She looked at the evidence of the final, cataclysmic battle. She looked at the man who had waged it. Tears, hot and silent, began to trace paths down her pale cheeks. They were not tears of fear or of sorrow. They were tears of release. The release of a burden she had carried for half her life. The weight of her past, the constant, gnawing terror of the goblin's darkness, had finally, blessedly, been lifted. It spoke to you, didn't it? She asked, her voice surprisingly steady. The creature that was here. Naruto nodded. It called itself the Abyssal Mind. It saw us as specimens. Data points in an experiment. I have spent my life fighting the tangible evils of this world, she said, turning to face him, her eyes shining in the golden light. Goblins, undead, demons of the lower planes. But that, what you describe, that is a cold, cosmic horror my faith has never prepared me for. An evil that does not hate, but merely studies. I've fought things like that before, Naruto said, his gaze distant. His mind flashing back to the cold, arrogant indifference of the Otsutsuki. Beings who saw entire worlds as nothing more than fruit to be harvested. They thought they were gods. They learned they were mortal. In that shared confession, in that moment of mutual vulnerability, the final walls between them crumbled. She saw him not just as a protector, but as a fellow survivor. Of a war on a scale she could barely comprehend. He saw her not just as a priestess or a victim, but as a woman of incredible, unyielding strength, whose faith was not a shield to hide behind, but a weapon to be wielded against the darkness. They returned to the surface to find the grim work of the aftermath nearly complete. The wounded were being prepared for transport. The dead, both human and goblin, were being gathered for consecration and pyre. Kalen gave a crisp, final report. 17 of her 50 soldiers had fallen. A heavy price, but one that would have been far, far higher without them. The journey back to Oakhaven was a somber, triumphant procession. The rescued prisoners, their faces still etched with the horrors they had endured, wept with relief as they saw the familiar, gentle slopes of their home. The villagers poured from their homes, their initial fear of the armed soldiers and strange priestesses replaced by a wave of overwhelming gratitude. They saw Naruto walking amongst the heroes. His simple farmer's clothes now marking him not as an outsider, but as one of their own who was so much more. He was their guardian, their quiet, unassuming protector who had Br. Otta stormed down from the mountains to ensure their peace. That evening, as a fragile, hopeful peace settled over the valley, the four women found themselves in their separate quarters, the weight of the day finally settling upon them. Kalen sat at a small, makeshift desk, a fresh quill in her hand, an official report to the capital before her. She wrote, "The goblin nest, estimated to be say, Veral 1,000 strong and led by an unknown intelligence, has been neutralized. Primary asset in the operation was an unregistered individual, Naruto Uzumaki." She paused, staring at the name. How could she describe him? Unconventional combatant, High-level magic user. The words were laughably inadequate. She dipped her quill again and wrote. Subject's capabilities exceed any known classification. His strategic acumen is unparalleled, and his combat prowess is absolute. He is, in this captain's professional opinion, the single most valuable strategic asset on this continent. She put the quill down. The report was factual, but it didn't even begin to touch the truth of the man who had healed his allies with a gentle touch and torn the heart out of a mountain with his bare hands. B. Runhild sat outside the village tavern, a large, frothing tankard of dwarven stout in her hand. She stared up at the mountain, now just a dark, silent silhouette against the star-dusted sky. She took a long, deep drink, wiped the foam from her beard with the back of her hand, and let out a contented sigh. To the mad lads, she grunted to the night air, raising her tankard in a silent toast. He ones who'd rather be planting turnips but'll crack a mountain in half if you piss him off. The best bloody kind of hero there is. In her room, Serafina cleaned her bow with a quiet, methodical precision, her long, elegant fingers working the oiled cloth along the polished wood. But her mind was not on her task. It was replaying the moments in the throne room, the feeling of his hand on her shoulder, the gentle green light of his healing. And it replayed the moment she had watched him heal Sword Maiden, the sharp, unfamiliar sting of jealousy. She was an elf of the elder woods. Her heart as supposed to be as calm and patient as the ancient trees. Yet this man, this whirlwind of contradictions, had awakened something in her that was wild, and confusing, and utterly, terrifyingly alive. And Sword Maiden lay in her bed, not sleeping, but staring at the ceiling, her hands clasped over her chest. The fear, the cold, gnawing terror that had been her constant companion for years, was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound warmth, a feeling of safety, a feeling of hope. Her God had answered her prayer, but he had sent a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man from another world as his messenger. Her faith was absolute, but her heart had found a new, and far more tangible, anchor in the storm. Naruto himself was not in the village. He was at his small cabin on the hill, sitting on his porch, watching the quiet, twinkling lights of Oakhaven. He had been dragged back into the storm, had unleashed the power he had tried so hard to cage. He had saved them. He had protected his fragile peace. But he had heard the abyssal mind's parting words. "We will meet again," he sighed, the sound lost in the gentle whisper of the night wind. The battle was over, but the war, he knew, was just beginning. And his quiet life, the simple, precious thing he had fought so hard to build, felt more fragile and precarious than ever. Chapter 8 End. Chapter 9. The Scars of Victory. The peace that set led over Oakhaven in the days following the battle was a fragile, precious thing, like a butterfly resting on a blade of grass. The sky, scrubbed clean by the passing storm, was a brilliant, cloudless azure. A vast and indifferent canvas against which the slow, painful process of healing began to unfold. Autumn asserted its gentle dominion, painting the leaves of the surrounding forest in hues of fiery crimson and warm, burnished gold. The air grew crisp, carrying the comforting, earthy scents of wood smoke from cottage chimneys and the sweet, sharp tang of apples being harvested in the orchards. It was a picture of rustic tranquility, a world determined to forget the bloody, monstrous wound that had been carved into the heart of the nearby mountain. But the scars remained. They were visible in the haunted, distant eyes of the rescued prisoners, who huddled together in the village temple, starting at sudden noises and speaking only in fearful whispers. They were etched onto the weary, grief-stricken faces of Kalen Ironhand's soldiers as they prepared funeral pyres for their 17 fallen comrades. And they were carved, invisibly but indelibly, into the soul of Naruto Uzumaki, W. Ho found that the quiet life he had so carefully constructed had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer just Naruto, the kind but enigmatic farmer. He was the sage of Oakhaven, the storm of the mountain. A living legend whispered about in tones of awe and fear. The simple, easy camaraderie he had shared with the villagers had been replaced by a respectful, fearful distance. They looked at him now and saw not a neighbor, but a protector, a weapon, a demigod walking in their midst. The fortress of his tranquility had been breached, not by monsters, but by his own heroic nature. He tried to reclaim his old routines. He rose with the sun, his senses stretching out to feel the pulse of the awakening village. But now, instead of the simple, rhythmic symphony of life, he felt the discordant notes of trauma and grief. He went to the fields, but found other villagers had already begun to harvest his allotted section, a gesture of profound, if misguided, reverence. They would not allow their savior to perform such mundane labor. Frustrated and restless, he found a new purpose. The miller's barn, which had served as their makeshift war room, had suffered some minor structural damage during the bottle's chaotic preparations. He went there, alone, and began the work of repair. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, the simple, honest labor a balm to his restless spirit. He lifted massive oak beams into place with an ease that would have required a team of a dozen men, his precise control over his own strength ensuring he never marred the wood. He used a sliver of wind-style chakra to strip old, rotted shingles from the roof in a clean, efficient sweep. He was a one-man construction crew, and his work drew an audience. Brunhild arrived first, a large, well-worn tool belt lung over her chainmail and a grin on her face. She didn't offer platitudes or praise. She simply picked up a heavy mallet and a box of iron nails and got to work alongside him. A proper dwarf can't stand to see a shoddy repair job. She grunted, her blow driving a 6-inch nail into a beam with a single, perfect strike. Besides, you're using too much muscle and not enough leverage. Watch an expert. They worked together in a comfortable, syncopated rhythm, the sharp thwack of her hammer a counterpoint to the quiet whisper of his movements. There was an easy, uncomplicated honesty to the DWA.RF priestess that Naruto found profoundly refreshing. She didn't treat him like a fragile hero or a terrifying weapon. She treated him like a fellow craftsman, albeit one with a ridiculously unfair amount of raw strength. "My people have a saying," she said, pausing to wipe a sheen of sweat from her brow. "A man's worth isn't measured by the ore he can mine, but by the quality of the steel he forges. You, lad, you're forged from something else entirely. Sky metal, I reckon." She took a long pull from a wineskin and offered it to him. "But even sky metal needs a proper smith to give it an edge. You've been fighting with your bare hands. It's effective, but it's inefficient. An insult to the craft of war." Naruto took a polite sip of the strong, fruity wine before handing it back. "I'm not a warrior anymore, Brunhild. I don't need a weapon." She let out a hearty, booming laugh. "Saying you're not a warrior is like a dragon saying it's not a lizard. It's what you are, lad, forged in your soul. You can pretend to be a sheep all you want, but when the wolves come, you'll still have teeth and fire. Might as well have the sharpest teeth you can get." She clapped him on the shoulder, a blow that would have staggered a lesser man. "Think on it. A weapon forged by Brunhild, inscribed with the runes of the Earth Mother, and tempered with a touch of your own strange, sunshine magic. Ha, we could craft a legend." Her offer was genuine, a mark of the highest respect a dwarven runesmith could give. And while he had no intention of accepting, her straightforward, earthy pragmatism helped to ground him. To cut through the swirling complexities of his new reality. With Brunhild, there was no subtext, no hidden meaning. There was only the solid, reassuring truth of wood, stone, and steel. Later that day, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley, Kalen Ironhand found him. He was standing by the river that flowed past the village, skipping stones across its placid surface. It was a simple, childish act, yet he performed it with a preternatural skill, each stone bouncing a dozen times before sinking without a ripple. Kalen approached with a crisp, military bearing, her armor polished, her expression carefully neutral. She held a rolled-up parchment in her hand. "Uzumaki," she began, her tone formal. "I have completed my preliminary report for the capital. I require your official statement on the events that transpired within the nest for the sake of accuracy." "You saw most of it," Naruto replied, not taking his eyes off the river. "We went in. We rescued the prisoners. We eliminated the leadership. The end. My report requires a more nuanced account." Kalen pressed, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. Specifically regarding the nature of the entity on the throne. Your description of a telepathic intelligence is not a standard classification. Nor is spatial transposition a recognized method of infiltration. Naruto finally turned to look at her. He saw the dutiful soldier, the commander trying to fit an impossible, paradigm-shifting event into the neat, orderly boxes of a military report. Some things don't fit in boxes, Captain, he said quietly. You saw what Sword Maiden did on that battlefield. Can you classify an act of God in your report? Kaylin was silent for a long moment, her professional facade cracking slightly. No, she admitted, her voice softer. I cannot. She looked at him, her gaze direct, analytical, but with a new undercurrent of something else. Respect. Curiosity. Why are you here, Uzumaki? A man with your capabilities could be a general. A king, even. Why waste your talents in a place like this, repairing barns and skipping stones? It was a question he had been asked before, in another world. In another life. But his answer was different now. Because I've seen what it costs to be a general, Captain, he said, his voice laced with a weariness that went far beyond his years. I've stood on mountains of the dead, my own and the enemy's. I have paid the price for victory so many times that I've forgotten what peace feels like. This, he gestured to the quiet village, the setting sun. The gentle flow of the river, this is what I was fighting for. I just never thought I'd get to live in it. I'm not wasting my talents. I'm enjoying my reward. His answer, so simple, so honest, and so deeply, profoundly tired, struck a chord deep within the war-weary soldier's soul. Kaylin had dedicated her entire life to the ideals of duty, honor, and the protection of the kingdom. She had never once considered what she would do after the war was won. This man had won his war, a war on a scale